sound came first, a strange, rhythmic tearing of the air. It wasn't the sharp, singular crack of a Mosin-Nagant rifle, a sound every Soviet soldier knew in their bones. It wasn't the high, frantic buzz of a German MP-40 or the deep, guttural burp of their own PPSH-41 submachine gun. This was something new, something different. A steady, hammering pulse of controlled violence. It was the sound of a new kind of death, arriving on the frozen wind of the Eastern Front. For the soldiers huddled in the mud and snow, it was the sound of the rules of war being rewritten, right in front of them, one terrifying burst at a time. This sound is the beginning of a story about a weapon that would crawl out of the wreckage of the deadliest war in human history. A weapon that would become a symbol, an icon, a tool of revolution and oppression all at once. It is the story of a rifle that you have seen 1,000 times, on the news, in movies, on flags. The Kalashnikov, the AK-47. This is Welcome to the Dark Historian. Get comfortable, dim the lights, slow your breathing. Let the world outside fade away. There is only this story now. Your mind is clear. Your body is at rest. Let my voice be your guide into the cold, dark heart of history. To understand this weapon, you cannot start in a design bureau or a factory. You have to go to a place of almost unimaginable suffering. You have to go to the Eastern Front of the Second World War. Imagine a world made only of gray and white and brown. The gray of a sky that promises only more snow. The white of that snow, a pristine blanket that covers countless horrors. And the brown of the mud, a thick, freezing, grasping mud that pulls at your boots, that cakes your uniform, that seems to want to swallow you whole. The air itself feels heavy, crystalline. It hurts to breathe. Every gust of wind is a physical blow, slicing through layers of wool and cotton, chilling you to the very marrow of your bones. This was the reality for millions of soldiers, a war of annihilation, fought on a scale that is difficult for the modern mind to truly grasp. It was not a war of surgical strikes or distant battles. It was a war of attrition, a meat grinder, a brutal, intimate struggle for every frozen ditch, every shattered building, every inch of blood-soaked ground. And in this crucible, the tools of war are tested in the most unforgiving way imaginable. The life of a soldier often depended not just on his courage or his training, but on the piece of steel and wood he held in his hands. And for the Soviet soldier, the Red Army man, his tools were often found wanting. For millions, the primary weapon was the Mosin-Nagant rifle. If you could hold it, you would feel the sheer weight of it. A long, heavy, clumsy piece of equipment. It was a design from the 19th century, a relic of the Tsar's army, still fighting in a 20th century war. It was a bolt-action rifle. This meant that after every single shot, you had to manually work the bolt, a clunky, mechanical motion. Grab the handle, turn it up, pull it back to eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to load a new round, turn it down to lock it. Now, imagine doing that in a quiet, controlled shooting range. It's a satisfying mechanical process. But you're not on a range. You're in the ruins of Stalingrad. Your hands are numb with cold, your fingers clumsy and thick. You can barely feel them. You are being shot at. The air is filled with the shriek of artillery and the crack of enemy fire. You fire your one shot, and now you have to perform that delicate, multi-step dance with the bolt. Pull, push, lock, all while someone is trying to kill you. It is an eternity. In that eternity, a German soldier with a submachine gun could fire dozens of rounds. The Mosin was powerful, yes. Its 7.62 millimeter round could punch through brick walls and stop a man in his tracks. It was accurate, a fine weapon for an open field, for a battle line stretched across miles of countryside. But this new war wasn't always fought in open fields. It was fought in the tangled guts of cities. It was fought in claustrophobic trenches and shattered factory halls. And here, the Mosin Nagant was a liability. Its sheer length made it impossible to maneuver in tight corners. A soldier would try to turn in a narrow hallway, and the barrel would clang against a wall, giving away his position. It was a rifle for a war that no longer existed. The Red Army knew this. They had another tool, a weapon born of this new, brutal reality of close-quarters combat. The PPSH-41. You've seen it in pictures. The simple wooden stock, the perforated barrel shroud, and that iconic, massive drum magazine sitting under the action. Where the Mosin was slow and deliberate, the PPSH was a storm of lead. It was a submachine gun, firing a smaller pistol cartridge, but it fired them at an astonishing rate. Over 900 rounds per minute. It didn't crack, it burped. A deep, rapid-fire roar that could fill a room with bullets in the blink of an eye. Soldiers called it the Papasha, or Daddy. It was a crude weapon, stamped out of sheet metal in factories that were little more than sheds. It was simple, easy to produce by the millions, and it worked. It could be dropped in the mud, frozen in the snow, and it would still fire. For clearing a trench or storming a building, it was devastating. A single soldier with a PPSH could suppress an entire squad of riflemen, forcing them to keep their heads down under a hail of inaccurate but terrifyingly dense fire. But it too had its fatal flaws. That high rate of fire that made it so deadly up close also made it wildly inaccurate at any kind of distance. It was a lead hose. You pointed it in the general direction of the enemy and hoped for the best. Across a street, in an open plaza, it was more of a noisemaker than a weapon. And its pistol round, so effective at 10 paces, lost its energy quickly. It couldn't punch through the same cover as the Mosin's powerful rifle cartridge. So you have this profound, deadly dilemma for the Soviet soldier. You have two tools, each designed for an opposite extreme. You have the long, powerful, but slow-firing rifle for distance. And you have the short, rapid-fire, but weak and inaccurate submachine gun for close quarters. What do you carry? Which compromise do you make? The battlefields of the Eastern Front were not neat and tidy. A fight could start in an open field and end in a hand-to-hand struggle inside a cellar, all in the space of a few minutes. You were constantly equipped with the wrong weapon for the moment you were in. This was the state of things, a deadly balancing act with imperfect tools, and then came the sound. That new, rhythmic hammering. The German soldiers who carried the source of this sound seemed to have broken the rules. They could fire from a distance, like a rifleman, but they could fire in long, controlled, automatic bursts, like a machine gunner. They weren't spraying wildly like a submachine gun. They were placing aimed, powerful shots, one after another, faster than any bolt-action rifle could ever hope to match. Soviet soldiers would capture these new weapons from the dead. They would hold them, study them. It was called the Sturmgewehr 44, the storm rifle. The name itself was a piece of propaganda, a declaration of intent. It looked futuristic. A stamped steel body, a pistol grip, a curved magazine holding 30 rounds. It felt different, balanced, purpose-built. And here is the genius of it, the paradigm shift it represented. The Germans had created a new type of ammunition. It was an intermediate cartridge. It wasn't as powerful as a full-sized rifle round, like the one in the Mosin Nagant, but it was much more powerful than a pistol round, like the one in the PPSH-41. It was the perfect compromise. Powerful enough to be effective out to several hundred meters, but with mild enough recoil that a soldier could control it during automatic fire, This was the weapon the Soviet soldier dreamed of. A weapon that could do it all. It could engage the enemy at a distance, and it could dominate in close-quarters combat. It was a single, universal tool for the chaos of the modern battlefield. The Sturmgewehr was more than just a new gun. It was a new idea. An idea that rendered everything else obsolete overnight. The Soviets were horrified. They were being out-innovated on the battlefield, and they were paying the price in blood. They knew, with absolute certainty, that they needed their own version. They needed their own storm rifle. The hunt for an answer began immediately. And this is where our story narrows. It focuses from the sweep of millions of soldiers down to just one, a young man lying in a hospital bed. His name is Mikhail Kalashnikov. In 1941, he is not a weapons designer. He is not a famous inventor. He is a senior sergeant in the Red Army, a tank commander. He is 21 years old. He is from a small village in Siberia, a peasant's son who showed a knack for machinery. He loved to tinker, to understand how things worked. He wrote poetry. Before the war, he had already shown some promise, inventing a few small devices for his tank, a counter to track how many shells it had fired. He was bright, curious, and deeply patriotic. In October of 1941, during the brutal Battle of Bryansk, his T-34 tank is hit by a German shell. The explosion is a cacophony of screaming metal. Shrapnel tears through the tank's armor and through Kalashnikov's left shoulder. Pain, blinding, searing pain. He is pulled from the wreckage, bleeding, his arm shattered. His war at the front is over. He begins a long, painful journey of recovery. He is moved from one makeshift field hospital to another, deeper and deeper behind the lines. And in these hospitals, surrounded by the broken bodies of his comrades, he listens. The hospital is a chorus of pain and regret, but it is also a place of intense discussion. Soldiers talk. They talk about home, about their families, and they talk about the war. They talk about the fighting, and over again, Sergeant Kalashnikov hears the same bitter complaints. He hears them from infantrymen, from machine gunners, from fellow tankers. They complain about the weapons. My rifle jammed, one says, his hands wrapped in bandages. The bolt froze solid. I had to kick it open. We ran into a German patrol in the woods, says another, his voice a low whisper. They had those new machine pistols. Before we could even raise our rifles, it was over. They cut my friends to pieces. Kalashnikov lies in his cot, his shoulder a constant, throbbing fire. But another kind of fire is beginning to burn within him, the fire of an idea. He is a mechanic, a tinkerer. He understands how gears and springs and levers work together. He sees a problem, a clear, deadly problem. His comrades, the common soldiers of the Red Army, the men who are bearing the brunt of this horrific war, are being let down by their tools. They are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. He hears the stories about the new German rifle, the wonder weapon. He sees the frustration and fear in the eyes of the other wounded soldiers. It's not just an engineering problem to him. It's a personal insult. It's a matter of national survival. Why can't we, he thinks, build a better rifle for our soldiers? Why do we send them to fight with weapons that are too long, or too weak, or too slow? Why can't we give them one weapon that does everything they need it to do? This thought becomes an obsession. It consumes his waking hours and haunts his dreams. He is a wounded tank sergeant with no formal engineering education, no experience in gun design. By all rights, he should have simply focused on healing, on surviving. But the question won't let him go. He asks a nurse for a pencil and some paper. In the quiet, desperate hours of the hospital ward, Surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the groans of the wounded, Mikhail Kalashnikov begins to sketch. He is not just trying to design a gun. He is trying to design an answer to the cold, an answer to the mud, an answer to the slow, clumsy bolt of the Mosin, an answer to the wild inaccuracy of the PPSH, an answer to the terrifying efficiency of the German Sturmgewehr. He is trying to design a rifle for the soldier he was, and for the soldiers he lay beside. A rifle that would be simple, so simple that a barely literate farm boy could take it apart and put it back together in the dark. A rifle that would be reliable, so reliable that it could be filled with sand and mud, and still fire without fail. A rifle that would be effective, giving the common soldier the power to fight on equal terms with a technologically superior enemy. He didn't know it then. No one could have. But in that sterile hospital room, with a pencil in his good hand and a burning sense of purpose in his heart, the seeds of the AK-47 were being planted. They were being watered by the stories of suffering and the bitter lessons learned in blood and ice. The crucible of the Eastern Front had created a need, a desperate, howling void. And in the mind of a wounded young sergeant, a solution was beginning to take shape. The story was just getting started, and it would only get louder from here. To understand the noise, the thunder that was coming, you have to first understand the silence. The vast, frozen silence of a Siberian village, a place called Kuria in the Altai Krai region. A place where survival wasn't a goal, it was a daily, grinding reality. This is where the story of the rifle begins. Not in a design bureau, not in a laboratory, but in the mind of a boy born into a world of unforgiving hardship. His name was Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov. And before he was a legend, before his name was stamped onto hundreds of millions of machines, he was just a peasant's son. One of 19 children, only 8 of whom survived to adulthood. Think about that for a moment. Think about a childhood where loss is so common, it's almost a season, like the brutal winter or the brief, muddy spring. This wasn't a world of theory and blueprints. It was a world of tangible things, of wood that needed chopping, of tools that needed mending, of simple machines that had to work every single time, or you would go hungry, or you would freeze. From a young age, Mikhail was different. He wasn't drawn to the fields as much as he was to the things that worked the fields. He was fascinated by how things fit together, how a latch closed, how a gear turned. He was a poet, too, writing verses in his youth, but his real poetry was written in metal. He'd take apart a clock, a piece of farm equipment, anything he could get his hands on, just to see its heart, to understand its soul. His family saw it as a curiosity, perhaps a distraction, but what they were really seeing was the forging of a mind that didn't think in complex equations, but in simple, elegant, and brutally effective solutions. He wasn't learning engineering. He was learning reliability. He was learning it in the frost-covered mornings and the exhausting, sun-beaten afternoons. This was the first part of his education, not in a classroom, but in a world that punished failure without mercy. When the state came for his family, branding them as kulaks, wealthy peasants, they were deported, shuffled across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union to another Siberian village in the Tomsk region. He was just a teenager. He escaped. He walked hundreds of miles back to his home village of Kuria. Think of the will that takes. The sheer, stubborn refusal to be broken. He got a job at a tractor station, and then at a railway depot. And all the while he was learning. He wasn't just fixing tractors. He was studying them. He wasn't just working on locomotives. He was absorbing the logic of their massive, powerful engines, He was seeing, firsthand, how heavy industry worked, how machines designed for immense stress were built, simple, strong, forgiving of rough handling and poor conditions. Sound familiar? His formal education was minimal. A few years of schooling, that's it. He was, by every definition, an amateur, a tinkerer. But his real education was far more valuable for what was to come. It was an education written in grease, steel, and the unforgiving logic of the Russian landscape. Then, in 1938, the Red Army called. Conscription. For many, it was a dreaded duty. For Mikhail Kalashnikov, it was an opportunity. He was no longer just a village boy who was good with tools. He was now part of the largest, most mechanized army the world had ever seen. And he was sent to be a tank driver, a senior sergeant in command of a T-34. Now, you have to understand what a T-34 was. It wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of Soviet industrial might, a crude, brutally effective beast of a machine. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't refined. The inside smelled of diesel, hot metal, and sweat. The gears required immense strength to shift. The vision slits were tiny, offering a terrifyingly narrow view of the world. But it was reliable. It was tough. Its sloped armor could deflect German shells, and its wide tracks could handle the mud and snow that swallowed other, more sophisticated machines. For Kalashnikov, this tank was a university. He loved it. He mastered it. He understood its language, the groan of its engine, the clang of its tracks, and he started tinkering again. He couldn't help himself. He developed a device to measure the number of rounds fired from the tank's main gun. He created a new kind of tank scope. His superiors noticed. This wasn't some farm boy just doing his duty. This was a man with a rare, intuitive gift for mechanics. His inventions were clever, practical. They weren't theoretical marvels. They were solutions to real problems faced by real soldiers in the field. He was even summoned to meet with General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most famous commanders of the entire war, to demonstrate his inventions. He was on a path. A promising career as a military inventor seemed to be laid out before him. And then, in the autumn of 1941, everything changed. Operation Barbarossa. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest land invasion in human history. It was a storm of fire and steel that ripped across the Soviet frontier. Kalashnikov, in his T-34, was thrown directly into this meat grinder. In the brutal Battle of Bryansk, his tank was hit. A German shell tore through the armor. Pain, blinding, searing pain, the smell of burning metal in his own blood, the screams of his crew. He was badly wounded, his shoulder shattered. He was pulled from the wreckage, another broken body on a battlefield littered with them, and sent to a hospital to recover. And it is here, in the quiet, desperate misery of a military hospital, that the real story begins. This is the crucible. This is where the legend of the Avtomat Kalashnikova is truly born. Lay with him for a moment in that hospital bed. The world outside is the thunder of the German advance, the retreat of the Red Army, the terror of a nation on the brink of collapse. But inside, the sounds are different. The quiet groans of wounded men, the shuffling feet of nurses, the low, hushed conversations that carry on day and night. And what were those conversations about? They weren't about grand strategy or political ideology. They were about survival. They were about the moments that led them to this place. And again, Kalashnikov heard the same bitter complaints from his fellow infantrymen. They talked about their rifles. The standard issue Mosin-Nagant was a good rifle, a powerful, accurate, bolt-action weapon. But it was a design from the 19th century. It was long, heavy, and slow to fire. In the close, savage fighting of the Eastern Front, in the rubble of a city or the confines of a trench, it was often too slow. Then there were the submachine guns, like the PPSH-41. These weapons could spray a lot of bullets quickly, devastating at close range, but they were inaccurate at a distance and fired a pistol cartridge that lacked the power to punch through cover. And worse, both could be unreliable. The bitter Russian winter, the endless mud of the spring thaw, the fine dust of summer, all of it could find its way into the complex mechanisms of a firearm and cause it to jam. And a jammed rifle, in the middle of a firefight, was a death sentence. Kalashnikov listened. He lay there, his body broken, his mind racing. He heard the stories of soldiers who died because their weapon failed them at the critical moment. He felt their rage, their frustration. It became his rage, his frustration. He had seen firsthand what happened when a complex machine like a tank was built simply and reliably. Why couldn't a soldier's rifle be the same? Why did his comrades have to fight with tools that were either too slow, too weak, or too prone to failure in the dirt and the cold? It was more than an engineering problem to him. It was a personal insult. It was a betrayal. The common soldier, the man in the mud, deserved better. He deserved a weapon as stubborn and as resilient as he was. So, he began to draw. With his good hand, helped by another soldier, he started sketching in a notebook. He wasn't an engineer. He had no formal training in firearms design. He was just a wounded tank sergeant with an idea. A burning, all-consuming idea. He drew concepts for a new kind of weapon. A weapon that combined the power and range of a rifle with the high rate of fire of a submachine gun. A weapon built not for the clean environment of a firing range, but for the filth of a real war. His first design was a submachine gun. When he was released from the hospital, given 6 months of leave to recover, he didn't rest. He went back to the railway depot, where he had worked before the war, and with the help of the workers there, using the depot's machinery, he built his first prototype. Imagine the scene. A wounded sergeant, his arm still healing, surrounded by locomotive parts and heavy tools, painstakingly crafting a firearm from scratch. It was a crude weapon, but it worked, and it showed promise, enough promise that it caught the attention of the authorities. He was sent not back to the front, but to the Soviet Union's secretive and intensely competitive world of weapons design. This is a world we can barely imagine. It was a high-stakes arena where the nation's best minds competed to create the tools of victory. It was shrouded in secrecy, driven by the desperation of a country fighting for its very existence. And into this world walked Mikhail Kalashnikov, a self-taught, 20-something sergeant with a half-healed shoulder and a head full of radical ideas. You can imagine the looks he got. He was surrounded by seasoned, highly educated engineers, men who had spent their entire lives studying ballistics and metallurgy. And here was this kid, this peasant, this tanker, who thought he could do better. They were skeptical. Some were dismissive. His first submachine gun design was ultimately rejected. It was deemed too complex to manufacture, too expensive. For many, that would have been the end. A noble effort, but a failure. But they underestimated the boy who had survived Siberia, who had walked hundreds of miles home after being deported, who had pulled himself from the wreckage of a burning tank. Failure was not an ending for Mikhail Kalashnikov. It was just more data. It was another lesson learned in the school of hardship. He took the criticism to heart. Too complex, too expensive. Fine. The next one would be simpler. The next one would be cheaper. The next one would be better. He went back to the drawing board. He worked obsessively, relentlessly. He designed a light machine gun, then a self-loading carbine. Each design was a step. Each prototype was an education. He was learning the craft not from textbooks, but by doing. By shaping steel, by feeling the recoil, by seeing what broke and figuring out why. And all the while, he held on to that core vision born in the hospital bed, a weapon for the soldier, simple, reliable, a tool that would not fail. He wasn't trying to build the most accurate rifle. He wasn't trying to build the one with the fastest rate of fire or the longest range. He was trying to build the most dependable rifle in the world. He remembered the stories of frozen mechanisms and mud-choked chambers. His design priorities were forged in the trauma of others. Then, in 1943, the Soviets captured a new German weapon on the battlefield, the Sturmgewehr 44, the St. G44. It was a revelation. It fired a new type of cartridge, an intermediate cartridge, less powerful than a full-sized rifle round, but much more powerful than a pistol round. This allowed the weapon to be controllable during automatic fire, while still having effective range. It was, in essence, the world's first true assault rifle. The Soviet military leadership saw the future. They immediately issued a requirement for a similar weapon, a new rifle for a new kind of war, chambered in a new Soviet intermediate cartridge, the 7.62x 39mm. A competition was announced. The best designers in the Soviet Union were put to the task. Men like Degtyarev, Simonov, Tokarev, legends in the world of Soviet arms. And among them, Sergeant Mikhail Kalashnikov submitted his design. He called it the Miktim, a simple contraction of his name and patronymic. On paper, it was promising, but it was still the work of an amateur competing against masters. He was still learning, but his intuitive grasp of mechanics, his obsession with simplicity, and his focus on the end user, the common soldier, made his design stand out. He wasn't just designing a machine, he was designing a promise. A promise to the men he'd left behind in that hospital, a promise that their tool would not be the thing that failed them. The initial trials were grueling. The rifles were baked in ovens, frozen in Arctic chambers, dragged through mud, sand, and water. They were fired relentlessly, thousands upon thousands of rounds, until they glowed red hot or failed completely. Kalashnikov's first entry, the AK-47, showed flashes of brilliance but was ultimately flawed. It was complicated, with features borrowed from other designs that didn't quite mesh. It was on the verge of being eliminated from the competition. Once again, he was facing failure. The experts, the seasoned professionals, were winning. Their designs were more refined. Their experience was showing. The committee was ready to send him packing. But Kalashnikov had a stubbornness born of Siberian winters. He refused to give up. He pleaded with one of the judges on the commission, a man who saw the raw talent hidden beneath the flaws of the AK-47. In a move that was technically against the rules, he was allowed to go back and radically redesign his rifle based on the lessons from the first trial. It was his last chance. He and his small team worked in a feverish, desperate push. They took the best ideas from everywhere. They looked at the designs of their competitors. They looked at the German St. G44. They looked at the American M1 Garand. But they didn't just copy. They simplified. They stripped away anything that was not absolutely essential. They refined every angle, every surface, every single moving part, with one question driving them: how can this be made stronger, simpler, and more reliable? The result was something new, something different. It was a hybrid, a mongrel born of battlefield experience and intuitive, self-taught genius. It was a collection of stamped steel and wood, assembled not with the precision of a watchmaker, but with the robust, forgiving tolerances of a farm tractor. He submitted this new rifle for the final round of trials in 1947. This was it, the culmination of the journey that began in a peasant village that was forged inside a T-34. That was born from the pain of a military hospital. This was his answer to the ghosts of his fallen comrades, and this time, the world of weapons design was about to be changed forever. The self-taught sergeant was about to give his final, roaring answer. That answer would not be a whisper. It would be a deafening, metallic roar that would echo from the frozen testing grounds of the Soviet Union to every corner of the globe. It would be forged not in a sterile laboratory by men in white coats, but in the crucible of a desperate nation's will to survive. It was a process of fire and ice, of failure and sheer, stubborn grit. The year is 1946. The rubble of the Second World War is still being cleared from the streets of Moscow and Stalingrad. The ghost of the German Sturmgewehr, that revolutionary rifle that so terrified Soviet planners, still hangs in the air. The order has come down from the highest levels of the state. We need our own. We need a weapon for the new kind of soldier, the conscript, the farm boy given a uniform and a few weeks of training. A weapon that is not a finely tuned instrument, but a brutally effective tool. A hammer for a new age. And so, the trials began. This wasn't some polite competition. This was a gladiatorial contest for designers. The best minds in Soviet small arms were summoned to present their creations. Imagine a vast, snow-swept field. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe. A line of grim-faced officers, their greatcoats pulled tight, stand with clipboards, their faces impassive. They are the judges, the jury, and in a very real sense, the executioners of dreams. In front of them, a series of strange and complex new rifles. Each one is a designer's vision, a lifetime of experience poured into steel and wood. You have the work of established masters, men with names and reputations. There is a prototype from Dementiev, another from Balkan. These are complex, elegant machines in their own way, products of a more traditional school of thought. And then, there is the entry from the young sergeant, Mikhail Kalashnikov. His first serious attempt was designated the AK-47. If you were to see it today, you might not even recognize its lineage. It looked different. It had separate upper and lower receivers, a feature borrowed from the German designs. It had a non-reciprocating charging handle on the left side, something you wouldn't see on the final version. The safety and the fire selector were two different switches. It was, in many ways, a more complicated weapon than the one we know. It was a solid design, a competent design. But in this competition, competent wasn't going to be enough. The first round of tests was a brutal awakening for the young sergeant. His rifle was put through the ringer alongside the others, firing for accuracy, firing for speed. And then the abuse began. The rifles were baked in dust chambers, thick with fine sand that worked its way into every tiny crevice. They were frozen solid. They were run over. They were dropped. And the AK-47 faltered. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, but it had stoppages. It jammed more than the rifle submitted by his rival Balkan. The committee's notes were cold and clinical. Kalashnikov's design was good, but it was not the best. It was recommended for removal from the trials. Think about that for a moment. The story could have ended right there. The most recognizable weapon in the world could have been a footnote in a dusty Soviet file. A failed prototype from a designer who almost made it. Kalashnikov was devastated. He saw his dream, his entire purpose since that day in the hospital bed, slipping away. The committee had made its decision, but here is where the story turns. Here is where a single man's belief, and perhaps a bit of political maneuvering, changed the course of history. Kalashnikov was a sergeant, yes, but he had powerful friends on the testing commission. He had impressed them with his ingenuity and his raw, untutored talent. He pleaded his case. He argued, with all the passion of a man fighting for his life's work, that he could fix the problems. He could make it better. He knew how. Against official protocol, against the rules of the competition, they gave him a second chance. They allowed him to return to his workshop in Kovrov and rework his design based on the brutal lessons of the trials. It was an unprecedented move, a bending of the rules that would have enormous consequences. Kalashnikov and his small team worked with a feverish intensity. They didn't just tweak the AK-47. They tore it apart. They reimagined it from the ground up, guided by a new and ruthless philosophy. Every single piece that was not absolutely essential, every mechanism that could potentially fail, was questioned. If it was too complex, it was thrown out. If it was too fragile, it was redesigned. This was no longer about making an elegant rifle. This was about making a rifle that could not fail. And get this, he wasn't too proud to borrow. He saw a superior bolt design in a rival's rifle, and, with the encouragement of the commission, he adapted it. He saw the simplicity of other systems and integrated their core ideas. This wasn't plagiarism. This was the pragmatism of a war-forged mind. The goal wasn't personal glory. The goal was to create the ultimate soldier's weapon for the motherland. What emerged from that workshop was a different beast entirely. The separate upper and lower receivers were gone, replaced by a single, massive, stamped steel receiver with a large cover on top. This cover, which you've seen 1,000 times, provided enormous clearance for the moving parts inside. It was a cavernous, empty space. Why? Because that space gave dirt, sand, and ice somewhere to go, to be pushed aside by the sheer force of the action, rather than jamming it up. The separate safety and selector switches were combined into one huge, clunky lever on the right side of the rifle. It was so big you could operate it with a gloved hand in the dead of a Russian winter without even looking. When you pushed it down from safe, it made a loud, distinctive clack. A sound that would become infamous. That lever also served another purpose. In the safe position, it physically blocked the bolt from moving all the way back, and it sealed the ejection port, acting as a dust cover. Simplicity. Brutal, effective simplicity. But the real genius was in the heart of the machine. The bolt carrier. Kalashnikov combined the bolt carrier and the gas piston into one single, heavy piece of steel. Think of it as a battering ram. When a shot was fired, gas from the barrel slammed into this piston, driving the entire massive assembly backward with incredible force. It hit so hard that it could crush mud, ice, or sand that got in its way. Then, a powerful spring slammed it forward again, stripping a new round from the magazine and ramming it into the chamber with the same uncompromising violence. There was no finesse here. The tolerances, the gaps between the moving parts, were deliberately made loose. A high-end sporting rifle is built like a Swiss watch, with parts that fit together with microscopic precision. The Kalashnikov was built like a farm tractor. Those loose tolerances, which would horrify a traditional gunsmith, were its secret weapon. They meant the rifle could be caked in filth and still have room for its parts to move. It could function when other, more precise rifles would be hopelessly jammed. This new rifle, this radically simplified and brutalized machine, was presented to the commission for the final round of trials in the winter of 1947. The air at the Shturovo proving ground was thick with tension. The other designers had also refined their weapons. Now, It was time for the final test, the gauntlet. The rifles were dragged through a trench filled with fine abrasive sand, then picked up and immediately required to fire. You could hear the grinding of metal on grit. One by one, some of the other prototypes choked. A jam, a failure to feed. The Kalashnikov, its cavernous receiver swallowing the sand, fired, and fired, and fired. They were submerged in barrels of water, sometimes left to sit and rust, then pulled out and fired, dripping and streaming. The water had no effect. They were dunked in thick, viscous mud, pulled out looking like nothing more than a brown club. The operators would have to struggle just to pull the bolt back, but that massive carrier would slam forward, scraping the mud away, and the rifle would fire. The most infamous test was the icebox. The weapons were left outside in the depths of a Russian winter, then sprayed with water until they were encased in a solid block of ice. The soldiers would have to smash the ice off with their boots just to find the trigger. For many rifles, this was the end. The mechanisms were frozen solid, but with the Kalashnikov, a soldier could place the butt of the stock on the frozen ground and stomp on the charging handle, using his body weight to break the action free. And once that massive bolt carrier was moving, the ice inside stood no chance. The gun would cycle. They tested for endurance, firing thousands and thousands of rounds without cleaning, until the wooden handguards began to smoke and char, until the barrel glowed a dull cherry red in the twilight. The rifle just kept working. They tested for the soldier proof factor. They were dropped from heights onto concrete. They were run over by trucks. The stamped steel receiver might get dented, but it would rarely break. Often, a soldier could stomp the dent out with his boot, and the rifle would continue to function. Throughout these trials, a legend began to form among the observers. The other rifles were precision instruments. The Kalashnikov was an appliance. It was a tool that worked, always. It wasn't the most accurate rifle in the trials. It wasn't the most elegant. It wasn't the lightest. But in the one category that mattered more than any other to the Soviet military, it was untouchable: reliability. The final decision was almost a formality. The committee looked at the results. They saw a weapon that a barely literate conscript could be taught to disassemble and reassemble, blindfolded, in under a minute. They saw a weapon that could be mass-produced cheaply and quickly using simple stamping and riveting techniques, not requiring an army of highly skilled machinists. And they saw a weapon that would fire in the Arctic cold, the desert sand, and the jungle mud. It was the perfect reflection of the state that created it, unforgiving, utterly pragmatic, and built to endure. In late 1947, the decision was made. Sergeant Mikhail Kalashnikov's design was officially adopted by the Soviet Army. It was given the designation Avtomat Kalashnikova Obraztsa 1947 Goda. The Kalashnikov automatic rifle, model of 1947. The AK-47 was born. The story, however, was just getting started. This was the birth of the weapon. Now, it had to be mass-produced. It had to be put into the hands of millions of soldiers. And it had to be tested not on approving ground, but in the unforgiving crucible of war. The journey from a national secret to a global icon was about to begin, and it would be a journey written in blood and fire. The simple, reliable tool forged in the snows of Russia was about to meet the wider world, and the world would never be the same. A design on paper is a ghost, a whisper of an idea, a promise of what could be. But to change the world, a ghost needs a body. It needs muscle and bone. It needs steel and wood. For the Avtomat Kalashnikova, that body would be forged in the industrial heart of a nation still bearing the deep, ragged scars of war. The journey from a single, winning prototype to an arsenal capable of equipping an empire, is a story not of inspiration, but of perspiration, of noise and heat and the relentless, grinding will of a state determined to arm itself for the struggles to come. To understand how this weapon was truly born, you can't stay in the design bureau with Kalashnikov. You have to travel east, deep into Russia, to a city that for centuries had been the armory of the Tsars and was now the armory of the Soviets. Izhevsk. Say the name. It sounds like what it is. A place of iron and industry, nestled in the Ural Mountains. A place where the winter winds have a special kind of bite. Imagine standing outside the gates of the Izhevsk machine building plant, known as Izhmash, in the late 1940s. The air is thick with the metallic tang of coal smoke and the scent of machine oil. It's a smell that gets into your clothes, into your skin. It's the perfume of power. The snow on the ground is not pure white, but a bruised, industrial gray dusted with soot, and from the long brick buildings comes a sound, a constant, rhythmic, percussive roar, the sound of a giant heart beating in time with the state's ambition. This was not just another factory. It was a city within a city, a sprawling complex that had produced Mosin-Nagant rifles by the millions, weapons that had armed the soldiers who fought and died at Moscow, at Stalingrad, at Kursk. The very bricks seemed saturated with the urgency of wartime production. Now, in the aftermath of that cataclysmic victory, a new task was at hand, a much more complex one. The challenge was immense. You have to remember what the Soviet Union was in 1947. It was a victor, yes, but it was a victor bleeding from 1,000 wounds. 27 million dead. Entire cities west of the Urals were little more than rubble and memories. The industrial base, while powerful, had been pushed to its absolute limit for years, running on pure, desperate will. The workforce was exhausted. It was a nation of survivors, of women who had taken the place of men in the factories, of young boys who had become men too soon, of veterans who carried the war in their bodies and in their eyes. And into this landscape of recovery and fatigue, the state issued a directive. Produce this new rifle. Not just a few for testing. Produce it in numbers so vast they could replace every submachine gun, every bolt-action rifle in the Soviet military. It was a task that would have strained a healthy, peacetime economy. For the post-war Soviet Union, it was a Herculean effort, a national crusade conducted not with banners and speeches, but with lathes and presses. The initial plan for the AK-47, the so-called Type 1, was a model of modern, efficient thinking. It was based on the same principle that had made the German St. G-44s so revolutionary. A stamped sheet metal receiver. The idea is elegant in its brutality. Instead of painstakingly carving a complex shape out of a solid block of steel, you take a flat piece of metal and, with immense force, you press it. You stamp it into shape using massive industrial dies. One moment, it's a sheet of steel. The next, with a deafening crash, it's the core of a rifle. It's fast. It's cheap. It saves on material and, most importantly, on time. It was the future of mass production. At least, that was the theory. The engineers at Izhevsk, skilled as they were, ran headlong into a wall of stubborn reality. The Soviet Union's sheet steel production was not quite up to the task. The metallurgy wasn't consistent. The tooling was difficult to get right. The giant stamping presses would slam down, and the resulting receiver might be perfect, or it might be slightly warped, just a millimeter off. In a machine with tolerances as tight as a firearm, a millimeter is a mile. The guide rails for the bolt carrier, a critical component, proved almost impossible to install correctly in these stamped bodies. Imagine the scene on the factory floor. The cavernous halls are filled with the rhythmic slam of the presses, but after each slam, there is a moment of tension. A foreman, his face smudged with grease, picks up the newly formed piece of metal. He squints, running a caliper along its edges. He shakes his head, and with a clang of frustration, tosses it onto a growing pile of rejected parts. Scrap, wasted time, wasted steel. The rejection rate was catastrophically high. For every receiver that passed inspection, many more were failing. This wasn't just an engineering problem, it was an ideological one. The plan was failing. The dream of cheap, rapid production was turning into a nightmare of waste and delay. The pressure from Moscow was immense. The new rifle was needed. Now, the Cold War was not waiting for Izhevsk to solve its metallurgy problems. So, a decision was made. A classic Soviet decision. If elegance and finesse won't work, then brute force will. They abandoned the stamped receiver for now. They went back to an older, more laborious, but far more reliable method. Machining from a solid block of steel. This is where the AK-47 as we know it, the icon of durability, was truly born. Not in the mind of Kalashnikov, but in the fiery, screaming process of the milling machine. Picture it. They started not with a thin sheet, but with a heavy billet of forged steel. A solid, dense brick of metal. This block was then locked into a milling machine, and the carving began. A high-speed cutting tool, lubricated by a constant stream of milky white fluid, would descend upon the block. With a high-pitched scream, it would begin to peel away layers of steel. Not stamping, but sculpting, shaving away everything that wasn't a rifle. The process was mesmerizingly violent. Hot, sharp slivers of metal, called swarf, would spray from the cutting head, curling into silver ribbons on the factory floor. The air would fill with the sharp, hot smell of tortured steel. It was slow. It was incredibly wasteful. For every finished receiver, a significant portion of that original steel block was carved away and discarded, destined to be melted down and reborn. It took far more time, far more energy, and far more skilled machinists to operate the complex lathes and mills. But the result? It was magnificent. The Type 2, and later the improved Type 3, AK-47 receiver, was a masterpiece of industrial strength. It was heavier, yes, but it was solid. It was stable. The critical guide rails for the bolt carrier were now integral to the piece itself, milled from the same block of steel. There was no warping, no questionable welds. It was a single, unified heart of iron. You could hold one in your hand and feel its density, its absolute, uncompromising solidity. It was a weapon made not with a quick slam, but with a slow, determined grind. A weapon with the soul of a hammer. This brutal, uncompromising approach to manufacturing defined the early Kalashnikov. It's a story of forcing an idea into reality, one steel block at a time. Before we follow these new rifles out of the factory gates and into the shadows, if you are finding this journey through history helps you find your own peace at night, a subscription to the Dark Historian is a quiet way to show your support. It allows us to keep the lights on in this archive. Now, back to the cold workshops of Izhevsk, where a new kind of secrecy was taking hold. As the production lines slowly, painstakingly, began to churn out these new milled receiver rifles, another layer was added to the story. Secrecy. Absolute, suffocating secrecy. The AK-47 was not just a new infantry weapon. It was a state secret of the highest order. The West, and indeed most of the Soviet population, had no idea it existed. The workers at Izhmesh knew they were building something important, but the full scope was known only to a select few. The plant was a closed city, its activities shrouded from the outside world. The first rifles that came off the line did not go to the average Red Army conscript. They were far too valuable, far too secret for that. They were earmarked for the elite. The tip of the Soviet spear. Imagine a cold, windswept airfield somewhere in the Pskov Oblast in 1949. A unit of the VDV, the Soviet airborne troops, is assembled in a hangar. These are the toughest of the tough, the first in the fight. Their commander orders the armory doors opened. And there they are, racks of them. The soldiers would have stared. This was not the familiar, long shape of the Mosin-Nagant, or the simple, utilitarian form of the PPSH-41 submachine gun. This was something else entirely. Dark, angular, the distinctive curved magazine holding 30 rounds of a new, intermediate cartridge, the pistol grip, the laminated wood stock and handguards glowing with a deep, reddish-brown finish that would become iconic. A young paratrooper steps forward. He is handed one. Feel the weight of it, heavier than the submachine gun he's used to. He works the charging handle. The sound is unforgettable, a solid, mechanical, reassuring clack-clack. Not a rattle, not a ping. The sound of heavy, precisely mated steel parts sliding into place. It's the sound of reliability. He would be instructed on how to field strip it. No special tools. Push a button, the receiver cover comes off. The return spring, the bolt carrier and bolt assembly. 5 simple, rugged pieces. He could do it in under a minute, even in the dark, even with frozen fingers. This was the ritual, repeated in secret bases across the Soviet Union, from the border guards of the KGB to the elite naval infantry. Small, select units receiving the new weapon, training with it in remote forests and firing ranges, far from any prying eyes or potential spies. They learned its temperament. They learned how the rifle kicked, a firm, straight-back push, not a sharp crack. They learned to control its climb during full automatic fire. They learned its astonishing resilience. They would drop it in mud, in snow, in sand. They would pick it up, rack the bolt, and it would fire. Always. The secrecy was total. In early photographs from this period, you will not see this rifle. If a soldier carrying one happened to be in a picture, the image would be censored, the weapon airbrushed into a featureless blob. It was a ghost in the Soviet arsenal. A rumor whispered in the halls of Western intelligence agencies. They knew the Soviets were working on something new. They had reports of a new cartridge, the 7.62x 39mm. But the weapon itself remained a mystery, an unknown quantity. This period of secrecy, from roughly 1949 to the mid-1950s, was crucial. It allowed the Soviet military to work out the kinks, to develop training doctrine, and to build up a substantial stockpile of both the rifles and their ammunition, all while presenting an image of conventionality to the world. They were building a revolutionary arsenal behind the curtain, while showing the world the same old Mosin-Nagants and T-34 tanks on parade in Red Square. The milled receiver AK-47, the Type 3, became the definitive version of this era. It was a product of its environment. It was overbuilt. It was heavy. It was expensive and slow to produce. But it was as tough as the nation that had forged it from the ruins of war. It was a rifle built with the grim determination of a people who had sworn never again. Never again would they be caught unprepared. Never again would they be at a technological disadvantage on the battlefield. And so, in the silent, cold armories of the Soviet elite, the numbers grew. From hundreds to thousands, from thousands to tens of thousands. A river of steel, flowing from the heart of Izhevsk out to the shadowy frontiers of the Cold War. Each rifle was a testament to a victory in a new kind of war, a war of production, of engineering, of secrecy. each one a dark, silent promise, waiting in the oil-scented gloom for its name to be called. The sound was still contained, a low rumble behind the iron curtain. But it was growing louder, and it was only a matter of time before the whole world would hear it. That sound had a weight to it, a physical presence. It was the sound of a new kind of power, born in a secret design bureau and perfected on the frozen testing grounds of the Soviet Union. But a sound like that, a power like that, can't be contained by walls or fences, or even by heavily guarded borders. It starts as a vibration, a whisper on the wind, and then it travels. It finds cracks in the iron curtain. It seeps through, and in the years following its official adoption, the distinct, guttural bark of the Kalashnikov began to echo in new places. First, it was in the hands of soldiers who looked like their Soviet counterparts, men in the gray-green uniforms of the Warsaw Pact. Imagine being a young Polish draftee in the mid-1950s. For years, you've been drilling with older rifles, heavy bolt-action relics from the last Great War, or perhaps the SKS, a decent semi-automatic carbine. Then one day, the armory doors open, and you are handed something new. You feel it first. The heft. It's solid, but not unwieldy. The wood of the stock and handguard feels coarse, practical. The stamped steel of the receiver is cold and functional, covered in a thick, black industrial finish. There are no polished surfaces, no delicate engravings. This is not a gentleman's weapon. It is a tool. You are shown how to field strip it. You press a button, the receiver cover comes off. The bolt carrier and piston slide out as one solid piece. It's a shockingly simple mechanism. 3 main moving parts. You can see how they work, how the gas from a fired round pushes the piston, which throws the bolt back, ejecting the spent case and chambering a new one. It's a brutal, elegant cycle of violence. And when you fire it for the first time, that's when you understand. On full auto, it's not a gentle chatter. It's a visceral, hammering roar. It bucks against your shoulder, a wild thing trying to break free. It feels like you are holding a contained explosion. For that young soldier, and for his counterparts in East Germany, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, this rifle was a message from Moscow. It said, you are part of this. You are part of our strength. Our technology is your technology. Our enemies are your enemies. But here's the crucial part. The Soviets didn't just ship crates of completed rifles. That would have been the simple way, the capitalist way. Instead, they did something far more insidious and far more effective. They shared the means of production. They sent the blueprints, the technical data packages, the tooling specifications. They sent their own engineers to oversee the setup of production lines in factories from Jena to Kugir. This wasn't just an arms deal. It was an initiation. It was the industrial equivalent of a blood pact. By giving their allies the ability to create the AK-47 themselves, the Soviets were binding the entire Eastern Bloc into a single, standardized military ecosystem, an army equipped with the Kalashnikov, from the Elbe River to the Ural Mountains, could share ammunition, share parts, share training. It was a logistical masterstroke, creating an immense, unified fighting force, all beating with the same mechanical heart. And so, the rifle began to change, just a little. Each country added its own small flourish, its own national dialect to the language of the Kalashnikov. The East Germans, with their Prussian obsession for precision, created the MPIK. It was, for all intents and purposes, a beautifully made AK-47, often with a distinctive plastic stock. The Hungarians developed the AMD-65, a strange-looking, compact version with a wire-thin folding stock and a prominent second pistol grip up front, designed for paratroopers and armored vehicle crews. The Poles, the Romanians, the Bulgarians. They all created their own variants. They were all cousins in the same deadly family, all speaking the same language of reliability and firepower. The sound was the same. The soul of the machine was the same. But the ripple didn't stop at the borders of the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War was not a conflict fought on a single front. It was a global chess match, played out in proxy wars across dusty plains, dense jungles, and forgotten mountain ranges. And in this game, the AK-47 became Moscow's queen. For a struggling revolutionary movement or a newly independent nation shaking off the yoke of colonial rule, the Kalashnikov was more than a rifle. It was a promise. It was a symbol delivered in greasy wooden crates. It said, "You are not alone." It said, "The old empires can be defeated." It was a steel and wood sermon on self-determination. The West offered money, advisors, complicated political deals. The Soviets often just offered the AK-47. And for many, the choice was simple. One fed your bureaucracy. The other fed your revolution. The rifle began to appear everywhere. In the hands of Fidel Castro's revolutionaries in the mountains of Cuba. In the hands of anti-colonial fighters across Africa. It became so intertwined with these movements that it started to appear on their flags, on their coats of arms. Look at the flag of Mozambique today. Right there in the center, superimposed over a book and a hoe, is the stark, unmistakable silhouette of a Kalashnikov, a weapon elevated to the same symbolic importance as education and agriculture. What does that tell you? It tells you that for them, the rifle was the tool that made the other two possible. It was the instrument of their liberation. But a weapon's reputation isn't forged in parades or on flags. It's forged in the mud and the blood of combat. It needs a proving ground, a crucible, a place where theories of design and reliability are tested, not by engineers in white coats, but by terrified young men fighting for their lives. For the AK-47, that crucible was Vietnam. To understand what happened there, you have to leave the factories of the Eastern Bloc behind. You have to travel to a place of suffocating humidity, of triple canopy jungle, so thick the sunlight never reaches the ground, a place of leeches, fever and constant, gnawing fear. And in this green hell, two rifles, two philosophies of war would meet. In one corner, you have the American M16. It was a product of the space age. It looked futuristic, made with aluminum alloys and plastics. It was lightweight, almost like a toy compared to the old M14 it replaced. It fired a small, high-velocity 5.56mm round, designed to tumble upon impact and create devastating wounds. It was accurate. It was sophisticated. On paper, it was the superior weapon. In the other corner, you have the AK-47 and its Chinese-made copy, the Type 56. It was a product of the Second World War. Heavy, simple, made of stamped steel and wood, it fired a larger, slower 7.62mm round that punched through cover with brutal efficiency. It wasn't as accurate as the M16 over long distances, but it was controllable on full auto and utterly, legendarily reliable. Now, imagine you are an American Marine, 19 years old, thousands of miles from home. You are on patrol, wading through a chest-deep, muddy river. The air is thick, wet, and hot. Everything you own is soaked. Your rifle, your brand new M16, is caked in mud. Suddenly, from the dense tree line, comes a sound you have learned to dread, a loud, distinctive, hammering roar. Not the sharp crack of the M16. This is deeper, slower. Ba-ba-ba-bap. It's the sound of the AK. You dive for cover, heart pounding in your chest. You bring your own rifle up to your shoulder, Flick the selector to fire and pull the trigger. Click. Nothing. A jam. A failure to extract. Your sophisticated, space-age weapon is fouled by the grit and humidity of the jungle. You desperately pull the charging handle, trying to clear the stoppage. You might even use the newly added forward assist, a plunger on the side of the rifle designed to force the bolt closed. A button that existed because the rifle had a known problem, but in this moment, under fire, fumbling with your weapon, you are helpless. That click is the loudest sound in the world. It's the sound of your own death. This was a story that played out with horrifying regularity in the early years of the M16's deployment. A combination of a rushed development, a change in gunpowder specifications that caused excessive fouling, and a lack of proper cleaning kits and training created a perfect storm of unreliability. American soldiers were dying because their rifles were failing them in the crucial moments of a firefight. Some were found dead next to their disassembled M16s, desperately trying to clear a jam when they were overrun. Before we explore how this reputation became a global phenomenon, I want to take a moment. These stories, these journeys into the darker chapters of our history, are made possible by your support. If you find this channel helps you to unwind, to think, and to rest, please consider subscribing. It is the best way to ensure we can continue to bring these narratives to light. Every subscription helps. Now back to the jungles of Vietnam. Imagine the other side of that firefight. You are a Viet Cong soldier. You are not a professional. You are a farmer, a teenager, a patriot. You are fighting in your own backyard. The jungle that terrifies the Americans is your home. It hides you, it feeds you, it protects you. And your weapon is the Kalashnikov. It is your constant companion. It has been dragged through the same mud, submerged in the same rivers. It is simple enough that you can be taught to use and maintain it in a matter of hours. There are no tight tolerances, no delicate parts to break. The loose construction that makes it less accurate at long range is precisely what makes it so reliable here. Dirt, water, grit. They don't stop it. The powerful gas piston just blows them out of the way. When you pull the trigger, it works. It always works. That simple fact gave the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army an incredible psychological advantage. They had absolute faith in their primary tool. They knew that in the sudden, close-quarters chaos of a jungle ambush, their weapon would not fail them. Its heavy 7.62 millimeter bullet could tear through the thick foliage, through small trees and bamboo walls, things that might deflect the lighter American round. American soldiers began to fear the sound of the AK. It was the sound of a relentless, unstoppable enemy. They also began to respect the weapon itself. It became a prized battlefield trophy. It was not uncommon for U.S. troops, especially Special Forces units, to discard their M16s and pick up captured AK-47s instead. They valued its reliability and its stopping power over the M16's accuracy and lightweight. And using it had another, more practical advantage. Its distinctive sound wouldn't immediately give away their position to the enemy as American. The experience in Vietnam cemented the Kalashnikov's global reputation. The story of the simple, rugged rifle of the peasant guerrilla defeating the complex, advanced weapon of the superpower was a powerful narrative. It was a story that spread like wildfire through the world's revolutionary movements. The AK-47 was no longer just a Soviet rifle. It was the rifle that had humbled America. The iron ripple, which had started in the factories of the Warsaw Pact, now became a tidal wave. The image of the AK-47, held aloft by a victorious guerrilla, became the defining image of late 20th century conflict. It was seen in the hands of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the Middle East. It was carried by teenage Sandinista rebels in Nicaragua. It armed militias and warlords across the African continent, from Angola to Somalia to Liberia. The rifle was leaving the control of nations and governments. Its simple design and the sheer number being produced meant it was easy to copy, easy to smuggle, easy to trade. It was becoming a currency of its own in the world's most violent places. A weapon designed by a state for its state army was now becoming the primary tool for those who wished to tear states down. Kalashnikov himself, a sergeant in the Red Army, had designed a rifle for the common soldier, for the defender of the motherland. He envisioned it in the hands of uniformed men, standing in neat ranks, protecting their borders. But the thing about a tool, especially a tool this effective, is that you cannot control how it is used once it leaves your hands. The sound had escaped the factory. It had crossed the ideological divides of the Cold War. It had been tested and proven in the world's most brutal conflicts. And now it was echoing in valleys and jungles and urban back alleys its designer had never dreamed of. But a sound, once released, cannot be called back. It can only multiply. It can only change its tune. And the song the Kalashnikov was beginning to sing was growing darker and more chaotic with every passing year. That first melody, the one hammered out in the secret design bureaus after the war, was just the prelude. It was a powerful tune, yes. Heavy, deliberate, each note carefully machined from a solid block of steel. But a song that is too difficult to play will never become an anthem. And the Soviet Union didn't just need a song for its army. It needed an anthem for the entire world's revolution, an anthem that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and in numbers that would flood the earth. The original AK-47, the Type 1, 2, and 3, was a masterpiece of design, but it was a brute of a thing to manufacture. Its heart, the receiver, was milled. Imagine a master sculptor starting with a solid block of marble and chipping away everything that isn't the statue. That was the process. A solid forging of steel was placed into a machine, and slowly, painstakingly, the excess was carved away until only the intricate shape of the receiver remained. It was strong, incredibly strong, but it was also slow. It was expensive. It wasted a mountain of steel shavings for every rifle that came off the line. For a nation still rebuilding, a nation planning to equip not just its own millions of soldiers, but countless allies and proxies, this was a problem. The song was too slow. The tempo needed to change, and the solution came not from a radical new design, but from a return to an older idea, one Kalashnikov himself had flirted with in his earliest prototypes. Stamped steel. Think of the difference. Instead of a sculptor, imagine a factory worker at a massive press. A flat sheet of 1 millimeter thick steel is fed into the machine, and then, with a deafening, rhythmic crash, the press comes down. Thump. The sheet is bent into a U-shape. Thump. Holes for the pins are punched through. Thump. Guide rails for the bolt carrier are spot welded inside. It's not sculpting. It's mass production in its most brutal and efficient form. What took hours of milling could now be done in minutes. The rifle that emerged from this process was the Avtomat Kalashnikova Modernizarovani, the modernized Kalashnikov, the AK-47. You've seen this rifle. Even if you think you've seen an AK-47, chances are you were looking at an AKM. It is the single most common, most recognizable firearm on the planet. From 1959 onwards, this was the standard. It was lighter than its milled predecessor by a full kilogram, a weight any soldier slogging through mud or mountains would thank the heavens for. It was cheaper. It was faster to build. The factories at Izhevsk and Chilla could churn them out at a terrifying rate. The visual clues are subtle, but they tell the whole story. Look at the side of an AKM. Just above the magazine, you'll see a small, rectangular dimple pressed into the steel. That little indent is there to add strength, to keep the magazine from wobbling. It's the fingerprint of the stamping process. The smooth, heavy look of the milled receiver was gone, replaced by a thin-walled shell, reinforced with rivets and those telltale dimples. The top cover was no longer smooth, but ribbed, again to add strength to the thinner metal. But the most famous innovation was screwed onto the end of the barrel. A small, simple, asymmetrical piece of metal. The slant break. It looks almost like an afterthought, a minor addition. But its effect was profound. When a rifle fires, the explosive gas exiting the muzzle pushes it back and up. The kick. In full automatic fire, this makes the barrel climb, sending bullets straying high over the target. The AKM slant brake was cut, so that the escaping gas was vented upwards and to the right. This push of gas counteracted the natural climb of the rifle, making it vastly more controllable when firing in bursts. A simple, ingenious solution. The soldier could now keep the song on key, even at its most frantic tempo. The AKM was more than a rifle. It was a statement. It was the perfection of a concept, a weapon for the conscript, for the revolutionary, for the farmer given a gun and a cause. It could be stamped out like tractor parts, and it was almost as simple to operate. The revolution now had its instrument, and the factories were the orchestra. But an orchestra needs more than one instrument. An army needs more than just a rifle. It needs a bass line, a heavy, rhythmic beat to pin the enemy down. It needs a machine gun. The Soviet doctrine was built around the squad. And in that squad, you needed a weapon that could provide sustained, suppressive fire. The answer, once again, was found within the Kalashnikov family. They took the stamped receiver of the AKM and stretched it. They made it thicker, more robust. They gave it a long, heavy barrel that could withstand the heat of continuous fire. They attached a folding bipod to the front to steady it. They redesigned the stock to be more stable when firing from the prone position. The result was the RPK, the Ruchnoy Pulemyot Kalashnikova, the Kalashnikov light machine gun. Here is the simple, terrifying genius of the system. A soldier trained on an AKM could pick up an RPK and know instantly how to use it. The safety, the charging handle, the trigger group, the process of clearing a jammet was all identical. They even used the same ammunition. The RPK could take a standard 30-round AKM magazine in a pinch, though it was usually fed from a 40-round box magazine or a 75-round drum. Imagine a squad of Soviet motor rifle troops. 8 men. 7 of them carry the AKM. 1 carries the RPK. The parts are interchangeable. The ammunition is the same. The mechanic in the field doesn't need 2 different sets of tools or 2 different streams of training. It was an ecosystem of steel and wood, a self-contained family of weapons designed for brutal simplicity and logistical harmony. The song was now a full composition, with the sharp staccato of the rifles and the deep, thumping rhythm of the light machine gun, and this family was about to go on a world tour. The Soviet Union didn't just build these weapons for themselves. They were tools of foreign policy, gifts to allies, seeds of revolution planted in fertile ground. They handed out licenses to their Warsaw-pact allies: Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, East Germany. They all began producing their own Kalashnikovs. Each one was slightly different, a local dialect of the same language of violence. the Romanian rifles became famous for their distinctive forward pistol grip, a wooden handle built into the lower handguard that gave it the nickname the Dong. The East Germans, with their reputation for precision engineering, created versions with unique plastic furniture and side-folding stocks that were works of art in their own right. But the single biggest producer of the Kalashnikov, outside of the Soviet Union itself, was a country that didn't have a license at all. A country that had once been a close ally, but was now a bitter rival. China. After the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s, the flow of technical data from Moscow to Beijing dried up. But the Chinese already had what they needed. They had reverse-engineered the AK-47 and were producing their own version. They called it the Type 56 carbine, and they would go on to produce more of them than any other nation on Earth, including the Soviet Union. The Type 56 is an icon of conflict in its own right. It's a hybrid, a mix of old and new. It uses the stamped receiver of the AKM, making it cheap and easy to produce. But it retains some features of the earlier milled AK-47. The front sight is fully hooded, a feature the Soviets had abandoned. And most distinctly, many of them came with a permanently attached, folding bayonet, a spike bayonet that tucked neatly under the barrel. You've seen it in newsreels from Vietnam. The image of a Viet Cong soldier armed with a rifle that had a built-in spear. That was the Type 56. China produced these rifles in staggering, almost unbelievable numbers, and they sent them everywhere. They armed the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong. They sent them to Africa to arm liberation movements and fuel proxy wars. They shipped them to the Middle East, to guerrilla groups and state armies alike. The song of the Kalashnikov was no longer just a Soviet anthem. It had a new Mandarin verse. The rifle was now an instrument of Chinese foreign policy, a tool to counter both American and Soviet influence. It belonged to the world now, an orphan of the Cold War, raised by anyone with a cause and a conflict. Before we follow one of these rifles into the deep, cold valleys of Afghanistan, a place where this family of weapons would tragically turn on itself, a brief pause. If these deep dives into the shadows of the past help you find a bit of quiet in the present, a subscription to The Dark Historian is one of the best ways to support our work. It costs nothing, and every click helps us to continue telling these stories. Your support is deeply appreciated. Now, back to the cold winds of the Hindu Kush. By the late 1970s, the world had changed. The battlefields had changed. The Soviets had watched the Americans in Vietnam, and they had learned a crucial lesson. The American M16 rifle, for all its early faults, fired a very different kind of bullet. A small, lightweight, incredibly fast projectile, the 5.56 millimeter. This small bullet did horrific things to the human body. Because of its high velocity and instability, it would tumble end over end when it hit soft tissue, creating devastating internal wounds far out of proportion to its tiny size. The old Soviet 7.62 X-39 mm round from the AKM was a sledgehammer. It punched clean, deep holes. It could tear through walls in light cover. But the new thinking was that it was often better to wound an enemy soldier than to kill him. A dead soldier is one man out of the fight. A wounded soldier is a screaming, resource-draining nightmare, taking 2 or 3 of his comrades out of the fight to carry him to safety. It was a cold, brutal calculus. The Soviets needed their own small, high-velocity round. And so, their engineers developed the 5.45 X-39 mm cartridge. It was their answer to the American 5.56. And it was, by all accounts, even more vicious. The bullet was long and thin, with a hollow cavity in its nose. Upon impact, this design caused it to destabilize and tumble violently, earning it a grim nickname from the Afghan fighters who would soon face it, the poison bullet. Of course, a new bullet required a new rifle. You couldn't just fire the new cartridge out of an old AKM. The result was the next major evolution in the family tree, the AK-74. At a glance, it looks familiar. The silhouette is pure Kalashnikov. The long magazine, the high sights, the selector switch. It is unmistakably a child of the original design. But the details show the evolution. The most prominent feature is the massive, cylindrical muzzle brake. It's a complex, multi-chambered device designed to tame the recoil and muzzle flash of the new high-velocity round. It makes the AK-74 incredibly controllable, even in full auto, but it also directs a ferocious blast of sound and concussion out to the sides. Firing one is an experience. Standing next to one being fired is an assault on the senses. The furniture changed, too. The classic wood was slowly phased out. Early models had a reddish-brown laminate, but the most iconic AK-74s were plastic. The magazines are not the black steel of the AKM, but a distinctive, recognizable bakelite plastic in shades of rust orange or deep plum. Later, they would be made in true black polymer. It was a modern rifle for a modern war, and that war was in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded, seeking to prop up a struggling communist government. The young Soviet conscripts who rolled into that rugged, unforgiving country carried the new AK-74. It was its grand debut on the world stage. They were armed with the latest and greatest evolution of the Kalashnikov design. And who were they fighting? The Mujahideen, the Afghan resistance fighters. And what were they armed with? They were armed with the Kalashnikov's past. They carried old AK-47s and, more commonly, countless thousands of Chinese Type 56 rifles, funneled to them by Pakistan and the United States. They carried Romanian AKMs and East German ones, weapons that had trickled in from the global arms market. The stage was set for a perverse and tragic family reunion. In the high valleys and rocky passes of the Hindu Kush, the song of the Kalashnikov became a discordant duet. The sharp, high-pitched crack of the AK-74 from the Soviet positions was answered by the deeper, throatier roar of the AKM from the Mujahideen caves. Brother against brother, the son against the father, the same basic design, the same enduring reliability, was now being used by both sides in a brutal, grinding war of attrition. A Soviet soldier, his hands cold on the plum-colored plastic of his AK-74, could be killed by a bullet fired from a weapon made in the same factory as his father's rifle. The simple tool of Soviet power had become the ultimate symbol of resistance against it. This was the new reality. The Kalashnikov was no longer one thing. It was a multitude. It was a family, and like many families, it was now fractured, its members fighting amongst themselves on battlefields a world away from where they were born. The rifle's journey was far from over. It was simply entering its most chaotic and blood-soaked chapter yet. The simple song had become a symphony of global conflict, its notes echoing from every corner of the earth. And the sound was only getting louder, and so the noise grew. It was no longer the clean, organized thunder of standing armies facing each other across a defined border. This was something different, something more chaotic. It was the sound of a crackle in the jungle humidity of Southeast Asia, a sharp report echoing through a dusty alley in Beirut, a sudden, terrifying burst of automatic fire shattering the quiet of a remote African village. The Kalashnikov had escaped its masters. It was no longer just a tool of the state, it had become a tool of the people. And depending on who you asked, that meant it had become the instrument of revolution, of liberation, of terror, of chaos. The rifle began to seep through the cracks of the Cold War's rigid structure. Imagine a vast, overflowing reservoir of steel and wood built by the Soviet Union. For decades, they produced millions upon millions of these rifles, more than they could ever use. And this surplus became a form of currency, a tool of foreign policy far more direct than any diplomat's speech. A crate of AK-47s, sent to a fledgling communist movement in Africa or a revolutionary front in Latin America, was a message, a promise of support, an investment in a future aligned with Moscow. The Soviets and their Chinese allies who were producing their own copies didn't see it as unleashing a monster. They saw it as leveling the playing field. They were arming the disenfranchised, giving a voice to those they believed were crushed under the heel of colonialism and Western imperialism. They would send a so-called military advisor, a man with cold eyes and a quiet demeanor, who would teach a group of rebels not just how to shoot, but how to maintain their weapons, how to break them down and put them back together in the dark, how to use the rifle as an extension of their political will. And the rifle itself seemed made for this role. It was as if Kalashnikov had foreseen a future not of pristine armories and well-supplied soldiers, but of muddy trenches, humid jungles, and desperate men with little training. Think about it. If you are a guerrilla fighter, your life is one of constant movement and scarcity. You don't have a clean, well-lit workshop. You don't have a steady supply of spare parts or specialized cleaning fluids. Your workshop is the jungle floor. Your cleaning kit is a rag and whatever oil you can find. The AK-47 thrives in that environment. It asks for almost nothing. Its loose tolerances, the very things that make it slightly less accurate than its Western counterparts, are what make it so indestructible. It can be dropped in mud, submerged in water, buried in sand, and with a few rough shakes and a pull of the charging handle, it will likely still fire. That is a kind of magic to a fighter whose life depends on the reliability of their tool. There's a simplicity to it that borders on genius. You can teach a boy who has never held a machine before how to use an AK-47 in under an hour. How to load the distinctively curved magazine. How to work the selector switch safe, full auto, semi-auto. How to aim down the simple iron sights. And most importantly, how to clear a jam, a rare event, with a few practiced motions. This wasn't a complex instrument for a professional. This was a tool for the masses. It democratized violence. And so, the rifle spread. It traveled in the hulls of rusty cargo ships, hidden beneath crates of grain or machine parts. It was dropped by parachute into remote clearings at midnight. It was carried on the backs of mules across treacherous mountain passes. It moved from one conflict to the next, a ghost passing through borders, sold, traded, captured, and sold again. A rifle that began its life in a Soviet factory might see service in Vietnam, then be shipped to Angola, captured by an opposing force, and eventually end its journey in the hands of a Somali pirate. Each scratch and dent in its wooden stock a chapter in a brutal, silent story. Nowhere was this story written more vividly than on the continent of Africa. As European colonial empires crumbled in the mid-20th century, they left behind a power vacuum. New nations were born, their borders often arbitrary lines, drawn on a map by distant politicians. These lines cut across ancient tribal lands and ethnic groups, creating a fertile ground for conflict. Into this volatile landscape, the Cold War superpowers poured their weapons and ideologies. The United States backed one side, the Soviet Union backed the other, and the AK-47 became the symbol of the latter. Let's travel for a moment to Mozambique. Feel the thick, humid air. Hear the constant buzz of insects in the dense bush. In the 1970s and 80s, this nation was torn apart by a vicious civil war. On one side was the Frelimo government, backed by the Soviet Union. On the other, the Renamo rebels, supported by Rhodesia, South Africa, and indirectly, the West. For the Frelimo soldiers and the revolutionaries who fought for independence before the Civil War, the AK-47 was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of their struggle. It was the tool that allowed them to fight back against the Portuguese colonialists. It was the great equalizer. They wove it into their national identity. They taught their children about its importance. The Kalashnikov was the arm of the revolution. It represented strength, vigilance, and the fight for freedom. It was so central to their creation myth that when Mozambique designed its new national flag, they placed the image of an AK-47 squarely upon it, crossed with a hoe, representing agriculture, and a book, representing education. Think about that. A weapon of war, an instrument designed for killing, placed on a national flag, the ultimate symbol of a nation's identity. It tells you everything you need to know about the crucible of violence in which that nation was forged. It tells you that for them, the rifle was not an object of terror, but of liberation. It was the tool that made their very existence as a free country possible. But the symbol and the reality are two very different things. For the people of Mozambique, the constant presence of that rifle meant unending war. It meant villages burned to the ground. It meant the rise of child soldiers, boys barely strong enough to carry the weapon, their faces a haunting mask of childhood innocence and learned brutality. The simple, rugged nature of the AK meant that even a child could be taught to use it. The sound of its distinctive, high-pitched crack became the soundtrack to a generation's lost childhood. This journey into the heart of these conflicts, tracing the path of this single object through so much human suffering, is a difficult one. It requires patience and a willingness to look into the shadows. If you find value in these explorations, and if these stories help you find a quiet space to rest and reflect, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It allows us to continue telling these important, often forgotten histories. Your support means everything. Now, let us return to the field where the story was far from over. Because for the people on the ground in Mozambique and in Angola, in the Congo, in Ethiopia, there was no pausing. The rifle's proliferation turned regional conflicts into relentless meat grinders. It made violence cheap and sustainable. When one side ran low on fighters, they could simply arm more villagers. When a weapon broke, another was easily procured from a neighboring country's war, sold on the burgeoning black market. The Kalashnikov ensured that the wars would not end for lack of weapons. They would only end for lack of people left to kill. Now, let's move north, across the Sahara, to the Middle East. Here, the story of the Kalashnikov takes on a different texture. It becomes entangled with ancient grievances, religious fervor, and the raw wound of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have seen the images, black and white photographs from the 1970s. A young Palestinian fighter wearing a keffiyeh, his face determined, holding an AK-47 aloft. The image became iconic. It was plastered on posters, murals, and protest signs from Beirut to Tehran. For groups like the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, the AK-47 was a godsend. It was light enough to be carried by mobile guerrilla units. It was powerful enough to challenge the well-equipped Israeli army in close-quarters urban combat. And it was supplied, generously, by the Soviet Union and its Arab allies like Syria and Egypt, who saw the Palestinians as a proxy in their larger struggle against Israel and its American backers. The rifle became, once again, a symbol. It was a symbol of resistance, of the Fedayeen, the freedom fighter willing to sacrifice everything for his homeland. Yasser Arafat was rarely seen without a pistol, but the image of his movement was the Kalashnikov. It represented a defiance against overwhelming military and technological superiority. It said, "You may have Phantom jets and Merkava tanks, but we have this. We have the people's rifle, and we are not going anywhere." But here, the story gets darker, more complex. The rifle's journey didn't stop with nationalist movements. It found its way into the hands of extremist groups, factions that splintered off, whose ideologies were more nihilistic, more brutal. The same weapon used by those seeking a homeland was used in the massacres of the Lebanese Civil War. It was used in terrorist attacks on airports and hijackings of airplanes. The clean lines of the symbol, the freedom fighter with his rifle, became blurred. The AK-47 was the tool of the martyr, but it was also the tool of the murderer. It all depended on which side of the barrel you were standing on. And then there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This was a turning point. Here, the Soviet army, armed with their own AK-74s, the updated version of the classic, found themselves fighting an enemy armed with the very same family of weapons, millions of older AK-47s and Chinese type. 56 flooded into Afghanistan from Pakistan, supplied by the CIA in a covert operation to bleed the Soviet Union. It was the Cold War's ultimate irony. The Kalashnikov, the great Soviet tool of influence, was now the primary weapon being used to kill Soviet soldiers. The Afghan Mujahideen became masters of guerrilla warfare, using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. And the AK-47 was their perfect companion. It was rugged enough for the harsh Afghan mountains. It was simple enough for a goat herder to learn to use effectively. The conflict in Afghanistan created a new generation of hardened fighters, and it saturated the region with millions of rifles. When the Soviets finally withdrew defeated, the rifles did not disappear. They remained. They armed the factions that would tear the country apart in a civil war, and they would eventually fall into the hands of the Taliban and a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who saw the Soviet defeat as a sign from God. The Kalashnikov had once again sown the seeds of a future conflict, one that would erupt onto the world stage decades later. The rifle's journey continued westward, across the Atlantic, to the jungles and cities of Latin America. In the 1970s and 80s, the region was a battleground of Cold War ideologies. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista rebels, armed with Cuban-supplied AKs, fought to overthrow the US-backed Somoza dictatorship. Their revolution became a beacon for leftists around the world, and the silhouette of the Kalashnikov was, yet again, at the center of their iconography. Further south, in the dense, suffocating jungles of Colombia, the FARC, a Marxist guerrilla group, waged a decades-long insurgency against the state. For them, the AK-47 was the only logical choice. It could withstand the constant rain, the mud, the humidity that would cause more complex rifles to rust and fail. It became an enduring part of the Colombian conflict, a conflict fueled not just by ideology, but by the lucrative cocaine trade. And here, the story twists again. The rifle of the revolutionary became the rifle of the narco-trafficker. The same weapon used by guerrillas claiming to fight for the people was used by Pablo Escobar's sicarios to enforce the brutal will of the Medellin cartel. It was used to assassinate politicians, judges, and police officers. It was used in massacres of rival cartels. The ideological lines, so clear in the early days of the Cold War, had completely dissolved. The AK-47 no longer cared about Marx or Lenin. It cared only about power. It served anyone who could pay for it, whether in cash or in cocaine. It had become a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold. As common in some parts of the world as a loaf of bread, its low cost was key. On the global black market, a used but functional AK-47 could be purchased for a few $100s. In some African conflict zones, the price could drop to that of a live chicken or a sack of grain. This cheapness, this accessibility, meant that any warlord, any gangster, any disaffected group of young men could afford to arm themselves to the teeth. It lowered the barrier to entry for organized violence. You no longer needed the backing of a state to wage a war. You just needed a little cash and the right connections. The rifle had taken on a life of its own. It was a self-perpetuating force. The conflicts it fueled created instability, which created more demand for weapons, which fueled more conflict. It was a vicious cycle, spinning faster and faster. The original designer, Mikhail Kalashnikov, was reportedly haunted by this. He designed a weapon to defend his motherland, to be used by soldiers in uniform. He did not design it for terrorists, or drug lords, or child soldiers, but a creator cannot control their creation once it is released into the world. The simple rifle of stamped steel and wood had become something more. It was a political statement. It was a cultural icon. It was a plague. It had slipped the leash of its Soviet masters and now roamed the globe freely, a stray dog of war, loyal to no one, ready to serve any hand that would feed it. The symphony of global conflict had grown into a deafening, discordant roar, and the ghost, the spirit of the thing, had well and truly escaped the machine. Now, it haunted the world, its shadow stretching over continents, its sharp, metallic voice calling out from every dark corner of the earth. And that metallic voice, once a state secret whispered only in Soviet armories, was now shouting. It was a sound that would come to define an entire era of conflict, a sound that would be seared into the memory of a generation of young men sent to a place they did not understand. For them, for the soldiers of the West, the story of the Kalashnikov wasn't one of patriotic invention or industrial might. It was the sound of the jungle itself coming alive. Imagine it. You are 19 years old. You are a world away from home, wading through water the temperature of warm soup, in a green, suffocating world that wants to swallow you whole. The air is so thick with humidity, you feel like you're breathing water. Every leaf, every shadow holds a potential threat, and then you hear it. It isn't the familiar, higher-pitched crack of the rifles your friends carry. It's something else. A deep, guttural, chattering roar. A sound that is somehow both mechanical and organic, like an angry beast hidden in the trees. That was the sound of the AK-47. And for American soldiers in Vietnam, it was the sound of fear. They had been sent to this war with the future in their hands. A new rifle, a product of the space age. The M16. It was made of lightweight aluminum and black plastic. It looked sleek, modern, almost like a prop from a science fiction film. It fired a small, high-velocity round designed to tumble and tear through human tissue. On paper, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a leap forward in infantry technology. It was America in the form of a rifle advanced, sophisticated, and deadly. But the jungles of Vietnam do not care about paper. They do not care about theories cooked up in a laboratory. The jungle cares only about what works. And in the beginning, the M16 did not work. The stories began as whispers, then became bitter complaints, then desperate pleas scrawled in letters home. The rifle was jamming, constantly. A soldier would be in the middle of a firefight, the world exploding in sound and fury, and he would pull the trigger. And instead of the reassuring crack of a round leaving the barrel, he would hear a useless click. His weapon, his lifeline, had failed him. The bolt would get stuck, a spent casing caught in the chamber. And in the seconds it took to frantically try and clear the jam, fumbling with a cleaning rod while lying in the mud. Those seconds were an eternity. For too many, it was the last eternity they would ever know. There were reasons, of course. Bureaucratic, logistical reasons. The army had switched the gunpowder and the ammunition to a dirtier burning formula without properly chrome-plating the rifle's chamber to compensate. They had initially, and disastrously, told soldiers that the rifle was so advanced it was practically self-cleaning, so they didn't even issue enough cleaning kits. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of hubris and incompetence that had lethal consequences in the rice paddies and triple canopy jungles of Southeast Asia. And all the while, as American GIs cursed their futuristic, failing rifles, the enemy kept firing. Their weapon, the Kalashnikov, was the complete opposite of the M16. It was a peasant's rifle. It was heavy, made of stamped steel and wood. It looked crude, almost agricultural. You could drop it in the mud, pull it out, and it would still fire. You could submerge it in water, neglect to clean it for weeks, and it would still fire. It was simple, with loose tolerances and a design that shrugged off dirt and grime as if they were minor annoyances. To the American soldier, the AK-47 became a legend, a dark, terrifying legend. It was the symbol of their enemy, resilient, stubborn, and brutally effective. They developed a grudging, fearful respect for it. They learned to distinguish its sound from a mile away. It was the sound of an enemy who might not have air support or advanced technology, but who had a tool that would not fail him. The contrast was a bitter pill to swallow. Here they were, the most powerful army on earth, with a weapon that choked on a little bit of dirt, while they're supposedly less advanced. Foe was armed with a rifle that seemed all but indestructible. The stories of American soldiers abandoning their M16s to pick up an enemy's AK-47 from the battlefield are a powerful part of the war's folklore. While widespread use was rare due to ammunition incompatibility and the distinctive sound that could draw friendly fire, the fact that the legend exists at all tells you everything you need to know. It speaks to a deep sense of betrayal, a feeling that their own technology, their own country, had let them down at the most critical moment. The Kalashnikov wasn't just a rifle, it was a symbol of reliability in a world of chaos. And the M16, for a time, was a symbol of a promise broken. This contrast, this battlefield truth, would haunt the American military for years, forcing a painful reevaluation of its own equipment and doctrine. Before we follow the rifle out of the jungle and into a very different world, if you find these stories offer a quiet space for your mind to wander, consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It helps us continue to unearth these histories. Now, the journey of the Kalashnikov was about to take its most unexpected turn. The war in Vietnam eventually ended. The soldiers came home, and some of them brought souvenirs, Helmets, flags, daggers and rifles. A captured Type 56, the Chinese version of the AK, became a prized and controversial trophy. For the first time, the Kalashnikov wasn't just a fearsome sound in a distant jungle. It was a physical object, resting in a display case or locked in a gun safe in a quiet American suburb. The ghost had crossed the ocean. It was no longer just a weapon of the other. It was here, and as it arrived physically, its image began to spread culturally. In the West, the AK-47 became the ultimate symbol of the bad guy. Watch any action movie from the 1970s or 80s. Who carries the Kalashnikov? The terrorists who take over the building. The drug cartel soldiers in South America. The faceless, Third World revolutionaries. Its distinctive curved magazine and angular profile became a piece of visual shorthand. If you wanted to show your audience, instantly and without dialogue, who the enemy was, you just put an AK-47 in their hands. It was the weapon of the outsider, the insurgent, the one who fought against the established order. It was never the hero's gun. The hero carried a Beretta, or a Colt, or later, an M16 that, by then, had its early flaws worked out. The Kalashnikov was relegated to the role of the villain, its reputation forged in news reports from war zones and reinforced by Hollywood blockbusters. It was, in the Western mind, a tool of chaos. And then, something strange happened. The Cold War, the great ideological struggle that had birthed the rifle and pitted it against its Western rivals, began to thaw. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, and in the new world that emerged, the logic of the old world was turned completely upside down. The Iron Curtain became a velvet curtain, and behind it were stockpiles of millions upon millions of Kalashnikovs. And the new, cash-strapped nations of the former Eastern Bloc needed something the West had in abundance. Hard currency. So they began to sell them. Not the fully automatic military rifles, of course, but semi-automatic versions, legally modified for the civilian market. And the biggest civilian market in the world was the United States of America. The first imports trickled in. Chinese Norinco and Polytech rifles, Egyptian Mahdi rifles, famously made on Soviet-supplied machinery, Romanian and Hungarian variants. They arrived in a country that, for 40 years, had known the AK-47 only as the chosen weapon of its mortal enemy, and they sold. They sold incredibly well. Why? What was the appeal? It was a mix of things. For some, it was the history. Owning an AK was like owning a piece of the Cold War. It was a tangible link to a world-spanning conflict. For others, it was the reputation that had been built in the jungles of Vietnam and the mountains of Afghanistan. This was the rifle that always worked. For the practical-minded shooter who wanted a rugged, reliable, and affordable rifle for sport or self-defense, the Kalashnikov was a compelling choice. It was the Ford pickup truck of rifles, not pretty, not sophisticated, but it would start every time and get the job done. And for some, the appeal was the rebellion itself. The rifle was a counterculture icon. It was the anti-M16. It wasn't the sleek, corporate, government-issue weapon. It was rough. It was utilitarian. It had an edge. Owning one was a small act of defiance, a nod to its history as the weapon of the underdog, even if the person buying it was a suburban accountant. The symbolism was just too powerful to ignore. The irony is almost too perfect to believe. The rifle designed by a Soviet sergeant to defend the communist motherland from the forces of Western capitalism found its most enthusiastic and devoted civilian fan base in the heart of capitalism itself. A weapon forged in the fires of collectivism became a celebrated icon of American individualism and the Second Amendment. Mikhail Kalashnikov himself expressed bewilderment at this turn of events later in his life. He couldn't understand how his tool for the Soviet soldier had become a beloved sporting rifle in the country that was once his nation's greatest adversary. This journey, from the enemy's rifle to a product on a shelf at a gun show, fundamentally changed the weapon's identity in the West. It was no longer just a symbol of a foreign threat. It was now part of the domestic landscape. Its silhouette became a common sight at shooting ranges across the country. An entire cottage industry sprang up, creating custom parts, accessories, and ammunition for a thriving community of AK enthusiasts. And as it became more common, its cultural footprint deepened. It began appearing in new contexts. In rap music, it became a symbol of street-level power and defiance against a hostile system. In video games, it became one of the most recognizable and popular weapons, the default assault rifle for millions of players around the world. It was a brand. The name AK-47 itself became more famous than the man who created it. Ask someone on the street if they know who Mikhail Kalashnikov is, and you might get a blank stare. Ask them if they know what an AK-47 is, and they will almost certainly say yes. The weapon had completed its transformation. It had passed through the looking glass. It started as a state secret, became the sound of fear in the jungle, then the villain's prop in a movie, and finally, a consumer product and a cultural icon in the land of its sworn enemy. It was a testament to the rifle's brutally simple and effective design, a design so good that it transcended ideology, politics, and borders. But this new life in the West did not erase its past. The rifle's journey was not one of redemption. It was one of complication. Its presence in American culture also made it a lightning rod in the country's fierce debates over gun control. Its menacing, military appearance, a direct result of its utilitarian design, made it a prime target for those seeking to ban certain types of firearms. The very features that made it an effective weapon of war made it a symbol of terror for a segment of the civilian population. So the Kalashnikov now lived a strange double life. In one part of the world, it was still the weapon of the child soldier, the insurgent, the freedom fighter. Its sharp, metallic voice still echoed in the real-life conflicts that scarred the globe. But in another part of the world, it was a hobby, a collectible, a tool for sport, and a deeply divisive political symbol. It was both a mundane object and a vessel for 1,000 different meanings, 1,000 different fears and aspirations. The peasant's rifle had come a long, long way from the cold testing grounds of the Soviet Union. Its shadow, once cast by the Kremlin, was now cast by Hollywood studios, by video game designers, and by the heated arguments of a divided nation trying to make sense of its own relationship with violence. The simple machine of wood and steel had become a mirror, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of the world it had helped to shape. And the reflection staring back was more complicated and more troubling than its creator could ever have possibly imagined. To truly understand that reflection, you can't just look at the surface. You have to go deeper. You have to look past the symbols, past the politics, past the millions of lives it has touched and ended. You have to look at the machine itself, at the cold, hard, mechanical truth of it. Because inside that simple shape of stamped steel and wood is a work of brutal, uncompromising genius. It's a testament to a different way of thinking, a philosophy forged in the frozen mud of the Eastern Front, where delicate, complicated things went to die, and the only thing that mattered The only virtue worth a soldier's prayer was that when you pulled the trigger, something happened. So let's do that. Let's go inside. Let's strip away the myth and look at the gears. How does a simple collection of parts become the most reliable killing machine ever designed by human hands? To answer that, you don't need to be an engineer. You just need to understand a few simple, powerful ideas. The first idea is about power. Raw, untamed power. Pick up an AK, or just imagine it. Feel the weight. Now pull back the charging handle. You'll feel a gritty, metallic scrape. You'll hear a loud, clanking sound as the bolt carrier slides back and then slams forward. It isn't smooth. It isn't refined. It feels agricultural, like a piece of farm equipment. And that is exactly the point. The sound you hear, the feeling you get, is the sound of the AK's heart, its engine. It's a system called a long-stroke gas piston, and it is the first key to its soul. When you fire a round, a tiny portion of the hot, expanding gas from the gunpowder explosion is siphoned off through a small hole in the top of the barrel. This jet of violent, high-pressure gas is directed into a tube that runs above the barrel. Inside that tube is a long steel rod, the piston, which is permanently attached to the bolt carrier, that big chunk of steel you pull back to load the weapon. This jet of gas acts like a hammer. It slams into the face of the piston, driving the entire assembly, the piston, and the heavy bolt carrier backwards with incredible force. Think of an old steam locomotive. The steam pushes a piston, which turns the wheels. It's a simple, powerful transfer of energy. The AK does the same thing, but on a miniature, lightning-fast scale. This isn't a gentle nudge. It's a violent, overgassed shove. The system is deliberately designed to use far more force than is strictly necessary to cycle the action. Why? Because Mikhail Kalashnikov and his team were designing for the worst day of a soldier's life. They were designing for a trench filled with freezing mud. They were designing for a gun that had been dropped in a sand dune. They were designing for a rifle caked in ice after a week in a blizzard. In those conditions, a gentle, finely tuned mechanism will fail. The friction from a single grain of sand, a bit of mud, or a patch of ice can be enough to stop a more delicate system in its tracks. But the AK's long-stroke piston doesn't care. That massive, heavy bolt carrier, slammed backwards by an overwhelming blast of gas, acts like a battering ram. It has so much momentum, so much raw kinetic energy, that it simply plows through whatever dirt, sand, or debris might have found its way inside. It smashes through the friction. It crushes the foreign objects. It just works. This is the philosophy of brute force. It's not elegant. It's not precise. If a surgeon's scalpel is the M16's direct impingement system, then the AK's long-stroke piston is a sledgehammer. It's messy. It causes the rifle to shake and jump more when you fire it, which makes it less accurate than its Western counterparts. But a surgeon's scalpel is useless in a swamp. A sledgehammer, on the other hand, will always break the rock. This design wasn't new, of course. It had been used in earlier rifles. But Kalashnikov perfected it, simplified it, and built an entire weapon around its brutal, simple logic. The logic that reliability, absolute, unquestioning reliability, was more important than anything else. More important than pinpoint accuracy. More important than ergonomics. More important than weight. Because a rifle that is a marvel of engineering is just a heavy club if it jams when you need it most. And a less accurate rifle that always fires is infinitely more useful than a tack driver that has gone silent. That is the first secret, an engine of brute force. But that violent push backward is only half the story. Once the bolt carrier has been thrown back, something else has to happen. Something that is, in its own way, just as elegant as the piston is brutal. As that heavy bolt carrier assembly travels backward, it performs a mechanical ballet. First, it has to unlock the bolt from the barrel. If the bolt didn't lock firmly in place, the explosive pressure of the firing cartridge would blow it open, right back into the shooter's face. So, how do you lock it securely, but also unlock it in a split second? The answer is the second piece of the puzzle, the rotating bolt. Picture a heavy door to a bank vault. It has massive steel lugs or teeth that extend into the doorframe to lock it. You can't just pull it open. You have to turn a wheel, which retracts the lugs, and only then can the door swing free. The AK's bolt works on the exact same principle. The head of the bolt has two large, opposing steel lugs. When the rifle is ready to fire, these lugs are rotated into matching recesses in the barrel extension, locking the bolt to the barrel as securely as that vault door. The chamber is sealed. It's safe. Now, remember that big, heavy bolt carrier we just talked about. It has a cam track cut into it, a specially shaped groove. As the piston drives the carrier backward, a pin on the bolt follows this groove. The shape of the groove forces the bolt to twist, to rotate, like a key turning in a lock. This rotation retracts those locking lugs from their recesses. In a fraction of a second, the vault is unlocked. Only then, once it is fully unlocked, and the pressure in the barrel has dropped to a safe level, does the bolt carrier continue its rearward journey, now pulling the bolt with it. As it moves, a small claw on the bolt face, the extractor, pulls the spent, empty cartridge casing out of the chamber. A moment later, the casing hits a fixed piece of metal inside the rifle, the ejector, and is violently thrown out of the ejection port. You've seen this 1,000 times in movies. The brass cartridge spinning through the air. That is the end of this part of the cycle. The bolt carrier continues all the way to the rear, compressing the main recoil spring, and then the spring takes over, pushing everything forward again. On its way, the bottom of the bolt strips a fresh cartridge from the top of the magazine and pushes it up the feed ramp and into the chamber. In the final moment of its forward travel, that same cam track forces the bolt to rotate again, but this time in the opposite direction. The lugs slide back into their recesses. The key turns. The vault door is locked. The rifle is ready to fire again. All of this happens in the time it takes you to blink. A violent shove, a twist, a pull, a push, and another twist. Lock, fire, unlock, extract, eject, feed, lock, over and over again. It's a rhythmic, mechanical process that feels more like a 19th century industrial machine than a modern piece of technology. And here's the thing. It's beautiful in its simplicity. There are no tiny, delicate parts, no complex linkages. Just big, simple, robust components. A groove in a block of steel, a pin on another, two big, chunky locking lugs. This simplicity means there are fewer things that can break. It also means the parts can be made with less precision. Which brings us to the third, and perhaps most important, piece of the rifle's genius. It's the genius of the empty space. If you were to pick up a high-end, precision-made rifle, like a Swiss Side or a German Heckler & Koch, and you shake it, nothing happens. It feels solid. The parts are fitted together with microscopic precision. The tolerances, the tiny gaps between moving parts, are incredibly tight. This is what makes them so accurate. Everything is perfectly aligned, every time. Now, if you pick up an AK-47 and you shake it, it rattles. You can hear the parts moving against each other. It sounds loose. It sounds, to the uninitiated, like it's poorly made. For decades, Western engineers looked at the AK and scoffed at these sloppy tolerances. It felt cheap. It was the mark of crude, mass production manufacturing. They were completely, utterly wrong. That rattle isn't a flaw. It is the rifle's single greatest feature. It is a deliberate, calculated, and brilliant design choice. Kalashnikov and his team understood something fundamental about the nature of warfare. War is not a clean, sterile laboratory. It is a world of mud and sand and dust and ice. And in that world, precision is a liability. Imagine those tightly fitted parts of a precision rifle. Now imagine a single grain of sand working its way between them. That tiny, insignificant piece of rock is now a massive wedge. The gap is so small that the sand grain can jam the parts, grinding the entire mechanism to a halt. The same is true for a bit of mud or a film of ice that freezes the parts together. The rifle is now useless until it can be meticulously stripped and cleaned, something a soldier under fire does not have the luxury of doing. Now think about the AK. Think about that rattle. That rattle is the sound of empty space. The tolerances are loose. The gaps between the moving parts are, by firearm standards, enormous. What happens when a grain of sand gets inside an AK? Nothing. The bolt carrier has so much room to move that the sand grain just gets pushed aside. It falls into the cavernous space at the bottom of the receiver, or gets scraped out of the way by the powerful motion of the bolt. The rifle doesn't even notice it's there. What happens when mud gets inside? The same thing. The sheer force of that long stroke piston and the heavy bolt carrier, combined with all that extra room, means the action just plows through the mud. It squeezes it out of the way, into the gaps, and keeps on working. You can find videos online of people burying AKs in mud, pulling them out, and firing a full magazine without a single jam. What happens when it's covered in ice? The soldier can often just smash the butt of the rifle on the ground, or a vehicle to break the ice, and the powerful action will do the rest, shattering any remaining frozen bits and cycling without issue. This is the genius of what engineers call loose tolerances. It's a design that anticipates failure. It anticipates the worst possible conditions and makes them irrelevant. The internal workings of the AK are designed to be a self-cleaning mechanism. The empty space gives the dirt and debris somewhere to go, and the violent cycling of the action actively shoves it out of the way. This philosophy extends to every part of the design. The controls are simple and large, easy to operate with thick, frozen gloves. The sights are basic and rugged, hard to break and easy to use. The rifle can be taken apart and put back together with no special tools. You can use the tip of a bullet to depress the pins. A peasant farmer with no mechanical training could be taught to maintain his rifle in a matter of minutes. This combination, this trinity of designees, what makes the AK-47 what it is. 1. A brutally powerful and overgassed long-stroke piston system that uses brute force to cycle the action, overcoming any dirt or friction. 2. A simple, strong rotating bolt with 2 massive lugs that lock up securely, ensuring safety and reliability. And 3. Loose, sloppy tolerances that create space for dirt, sand, mud, and ice to be pushed aside, making the weapon famously immune to the elements. These 3 principles work together in perfect, brutal harmony. They create a machine that is not defined by its perfection, but by its profound and deep understanding of imperfection. It understands that the world is a dirty, messy, and violent place. It was born from that understanding. It does not try to rise above it. It thrives in it. It's a mechanical worldview, a belief system rendered in steel. It doesn't assume the best. It assumes the absolute worst. It assumes the soldier is a conscript with minimal training. It assumes the ammunition is old and corrosive. It assumes the maintenance will be poor or non-existent. It assumes the environment will be a frozen hellscape or a sweltering, muddy jungle, and it is designed to function flawlessly under all of those assumptions. That is the source of its power. It is not just a tool, but a solution, a rugged, simple, and terrifyingly effective solution to the problem of human conflict in the harshest corners of the world. Its mechanical simplicity is a direct reflection of the grim reality it was designed for, a reality where the only thing that matters is that the machine keeps working long after more complicated things have fallen silent. And in that silence, after the complicated things have broken, you can hear the true sound of this rifle's legacy. It is not the sharp, deafening crack of its discharge. It is something much quieter, a persistent, humming echo that has spread across the entire globe, a low frequency of sorrow and conflict, carried on the wind from 1,000 forgotten battlefields. The grim reality that the AK-47 was built for did not stay contained behind the Iron Curtain. It seeped through the cracks of crumbling empires and spilled out into a world that was tragically ready for it. What happens when a weapon designed for total war, for the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, is released from its cage? What happens when a tool of such brutal efficiency becomes as common as the shovel or the cooking pot in some parts of the world? The story of the AK-47's second life, its life after the Cold War, is not one of state-controlled factories and meticulous design bureaus. It is a story of chaos, a story of rust and desperation and opportunity. To understand it, you have to picture the slow, groaning collapse of the Soviet Union. Imagine vast, sprawling armories, concrete bunkers dug deep into the frozen earth, stretching for miles. Inside, not thousands, but millions of Kalashnikovs sit in wooden crates, slathered in cosmoline, a thick, greasy preservative. They are a silent army, waiting for a war that, for the most part, never came. And then, the state that built them, the state that guarded them, simply dissolves. Borders become porous. Authority vanishes overnight. A general in a forgotten military district, his pension now worthless, his future uncertain, looks at the manifest for the warehouse under his command. He sees not rifles, but a retirement fund. He sees a way to feed his family. A lowly guard, unpaid for months, sees a way to get out, to start a new life. A crate of 20 rifles sold to a man with a truck is enough, and that man with a truck knows another man with a boat. And the boat sails to a shore where men are willing to trade diamonds, or drugs, or simple, untraceable cash for the ability to project power. This was the great uncorking. The pressure that had built up for 50 years was released, and a flood of cheap, reliable, and deadly weapons poured into the world's most vulnerable places. It was a torrent. The numbers are staggering, almost impossible to truly comprehend. An estimated 100 million Kalashnikov pattern rifles exist in the world today. Think about that. One for every 70 people on the planet. And the vast majority are not in the hands of disciplined, state-sanctioned armies. They are everywhere else. They traveled in the holds of aging cargo ships, their origins obscured by falsified documents. They were strapped to the backs of mules, winding through treacherous mountain passes in Afghanistan. They were hidden under sacks of grain in pickup trucks, bouncing across the Sahel Desert. Each rifle, a simple thing of stamped steel and laminated wood, carried with it the ghost of the Soviet factory where it was born. But it was about to be given a new name, a new purpose, in a land its creator could never have imagined. The price of this reliability, the very thing that made the rifle so successful, was now its most terrifying feature. An AK-47 could be buried in the mud for a year, dug up, rinsed in a river, and it would still fire. It required almost no maintenance. Its parts were loose, rattling, designed to function even when clogged with sand or dirt. This wasn't just a selling point for an army. It was a promise to the untrained insurgent, the desperate rebel, the farmer-turned-fighter. You don't need a supply chain. You don't need an armorer. You just need this, and it will work. And so, the rifle became the engine of the small war, the civil war, the ethnic conflict, the insurgency. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, it had already proven its worth against the might of the American military. The clatter of the AK became the soundtrack to the Vietnam War, a sound that haunted the dreams of a generation of soldiers. But that was just the beginning. In Afghanistan, it became the Kalashnikov in the hands of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. The very weapon created to defend the Soviet sphere was now the primary tool being used to dismantle it. One bloody ambush at a time. It was a cruel irony, written in spent cartridges on the high mountain passes. The Soviets had armed the world, and now the world was firing back with their own invention. Then, you look to Africa, to the long, brutal civil wars that tore nations apart in the 1990s. Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda. In news footage from that era, the AK-47 is a constant, menacing presence. It is slung over the shoulders of government soldiers, rebels and mercenaries alike. It is the great equalizer. It allows a small, poorly funded group to challenge a national army. It allows a conflict to burn for years, even decades, fueled by an almost endless supply of cheap weapons and ammunition. It turns skirmishes into massacres. It makes peace an impossible dream, because the tools of war are simply too easy to acquire. The Kalashnikov didn't create these conflicts, of course. The seeds of hatred, of political failure, of ethnic strife were already there. But the rifle was the water, the fertilizer, that allowed those seeds to grow into forests of unimaginable horror. This is a difficult part of the story to sit with. The true weight of this legacy. Before we continue to trace its final echoes through history, if these explorations help you find stillness in the dark, a small act like subscribing helps this channel continue its work. We appreciate your support. Now, let us return to the shadow of the Kalashnikov. Perhaps the most sickening chapter in this weapon's human cost is not about numbers, or armies, or even nations. It's about size. The AK-47 is not a particularly large or heavy rifle. It weighs about 4 kilograms, or just under 10 pounds, when loaded. Its recoil is manageable. It is brutally simple to operate. You pull a lever, you point, you pull the trigger. A child can learn to do it in under an hour. And this simple, horrifying fact has led to one of the greatest tragedies of modern warfare, the child soldier. In the chaos of a collapsed state, when social structures have been obliterated, children are the most vulnerable. They are easily manipulated, easily indoctrinated, and a weapon like the AK-47 transforms them. It gives a small, frightened child a sense of power they have never known. It becomes a surrogate parent, a source of authority, a shield against a terrifying world. Warlords and rebel commanders understood this all too well. A child with a rifle is loyal. A child with a rifle is fearless in a way an adult, who understands mortality, can never be. And a child with a rifle is cheap. You have seen the images, even if you try to look away. A boy, no older than 12, the rifle almost as tall as he is. His eyes are old, vacant. He is wearing a t-shirt with a faded cartoon character on it, a jarring reminder of the childhood that was stolen from him. The weapon is a part of him now. He knows how to strip it, clean it, and load it better than he knows how to read. Its familiar weight on his shoulder is the only constant in his life. The smell of gun oil is more familiar than the smell of his mother's cooking. This is the ultimate perversion of Mikhail Kalashnikov's design. The very features that made it a soldier-proof weapon for the Red Army, its simplicity, its reliability, its manageable size, made it the perfect tool for turning children into killers. It erased the line. It took the last sacred sanctuary of innocence and turned it into a new kind of battlefield. The sound of the AK-47 in the hands of a child is a sound of a profound failure. A failure of politics, of humanity, of our collective duty to protect the young. And as the rifle spread, it began to change. It became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol, a powerful global icon. For some, it was a symbol of revolution, of liberation. It was the rifle of Che Guevara, of the Viet Cong, of countless movements fighting against colonial or imperial powers. It was the underdog's weapon. Its silhouette appeared on posters, on murals, on t-shirts. It was romanticized, turned into a piece of revolutionary chic. The nation of Mozambique went so far as to place the image of an AK-47 directly on its national flag, a tribute to the weapon that helped it win its independence. There it is, crossed with a hoe, symbolizing the union of the fight and the farm, the struggle and the sustenance of the people. Can you imagine that? A weapon of war, an instrument of death, elevated to the highest national symbol. It shows just how deeply the rifle had embedded itself into the identity of entire nations. But for every person who sees liberation in that silhouette, there are countless others who see something else. They see terror. They see oppression. They see the masked gunman, the pirate, the drug cartel enforcer. They see the face of the man who destroyed their village, who took their family. The AK-47 is unique in this. It is the weapon of both the state and the anti-state. It is used by soldiers to enforce order and by rebels to sow chaos. It is a symbol of freedom and a symbol of tyranny, often at the same time, in the same country. The rifle itself, of course, is indifferent. It has no ideology. It is a machine. The stamped steel receiver does not care if it is held by a freedom fighter or a despot. The wooden stock does not judge the morality of its user. It simply functions. It does the one thing it was designed to do with chilling efficiency. It continues to work long after the reasons for the fighting have been forgotten. Long after the politicians who started the war are dead and gone, the rifle remains, passed down from father to son, from one generation of fighters to the next. A cursed inheritance. This is the heavy legacy of Mikhail Kalashnikov's creation. He always maintained that he designed the weapon to defend his motherland. "I sleep well at night," he often said. He blamed not his invention, but the politicians who used it for evil. And perhaps he was right. You cannot blame the hammer for the nail it is driven into. But when you create a hammer that is so good, so cheap, and so indestructible that it spreads to every corner of the world and falls into the hands of anyone who wants it, you have to ask a difficult question. At what point does the tool's perfection become a problem in itself? The AK-47 was, in many ways, too good at its job. It was too reliable, too simple, too easy to produce. Its success became a curse upon the world. It democratized violence on a scale never before seen. It gave the power of a modern infantryman to anyone with a few $100s. It fueled a global black market that thrives on instability and profits from human misery. And so, the echo continues. Every time a news report mentions a conflict in some remote corner of the globe, listen closely. Look at the images. You will see it. The curved magazine, the high front sight, the simple utilitarian shape. It is the ghost that haunts the modern world, a ghost forged in the fires of a world war. Let loose upon the world by the collapse of an empire, a testament to a brilliant, terrible design. The story of the steel and wood is almost over, but the story of the lives it has touched, the history it has shaped, and the future it will continue to influence. That story has no end. It is written every day, in the dust of forgotten villages and the back alleys of sprawling cities, a story told in the universal language of a simple, reliable, and endlessly tragic machine. The weight of that legacy is immense. It is the collective weight of millions of lives cut short, of futures erased, of childhoods lost. It is a weight that rests heavily on our shared history, a dark shadow stretching from a snowy design bureau in Izhevsk to every corner of the inhabited world. And in the quiet of the night, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. That low, humming frequency. The sound of a world saturated with the perfect tool for its own destruction. And with that sound, we are left with a question, a human question. What of the man who started it all? What happens when a ghost you created haunts the entire world? To find that answer, you have to leave the battlefields. You have to leave the jungles and the deserts, the dusty streets and the corridors of power. You have to travel to a quiet apartment in a city called Izhevsk, in the heart of Russia. And you have to sit with an old man, a man in his 90s, decorated with the highest honors his nation could bestow. A man who, by all accounts, was a national hero, Mikhail Kalashnikov. For most of his life, the story he told was simple. It was clean. He was a soldier, a patriot, a tank sergeant who was wounded in the brutal fighting of 1941. Lying in a hospital bed, hearing his comrades complain about their unreliable rifles, a fire was lit within him. He wasn't trying to build a weapon of conquest. He was trying to build a shield. He was forging a tool so that Russian boys would never again face the superior firepower of an invader with faulty equipment. He would say, time and time again, with a steady voice and clear eyes, I created a weapon to defend the fatherland's borders, and for a long time that was enough. It was enough for him. It was enough for his country. You can picture him, can't you? The celebrated inventor, the hero of socialist labor, walking through the factory that bore his name, the air thick with the smell of cutting oil and hot metal. He would run his hand over the receiver of a freshly minted rifle, feeling the familiar, perfect heft. He would see not a tool for killing, but a testament to elegant, simple and rugged design. He was an engineer, a poet of gears and springs. He saw the beauty in its function, the genius in its simplicity. He was proud, and why wouldn't he be? His invention worked. It worked flawlessly, everywhere, every time. It was, in its own mechanical way, perfect. He would sleep well at night, he told reporters. He would insist on it. I sleep soundly, he would say. The blame, he argued, lay with politicians who used it for aggression, not with the tinkerer who simply wanted to protect his home. It was a neat separation, a wall he built in his mind between the tool and the deed, between the creator and the consequence. But walls, even the strongest ones, can develop cracks over time, and the world kept showing him images that tested the foundations of that wall. Imagine him in his later years. The Soviet Union is gone. The world has changed. He sits in his modest apartment, the television flickering in the corner of the room. He sees his creation, his ghost. It is not in the hands of a Russian soldier defending the motherland. It is slung over the shoulder of a child in a war-torn African nation, a boy with eyes far too old for his face. He sees it brandished from the back of a technical, a makeshift war machine in a dusty Middle Eastern city. He sees it held by narco-traffickers in Latin America, by terrorists, by criminals, by revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. He sees his name, his legacy, written in blood, in languages he cannot speak, in conflicts he cannot comprehend. The clean, simple story begins to fray at the edges. The pride of the engineer is a powerful thing, but what happens when it is confronted, day after day, with the horror of its application? He once met Eugene Stoner, the American who designed the M16 rifle, his weapon's great rival. Two old men, two titans of firearm design, sharing a strange and unique burden. Kalashnikov asked him the question that must have echoed in his own mind. How do you sleep at night? Stoner, it said, replied that he slept just fine. He knew his rifle was used to defend freedom. A simple answer, a clean answer, just like the one Kalashnikov himself used to give. But the question lingered, because the world is not simple, and it is not clean. As he grew older, as the list of conflicts fueled by his invention grew longer and longer, the cracks in that wall in his mind began to widen. The pride was still there. It had to be. It was the bedrock of his identity. He would still defend the design, the purpose. It is not my fault that it was used where it should not have been, he would say, but a new note began to creep into his voice. A weariness. A shadow in his eyes that the metals on his chest could not outshine. He began to speak of a pain, not a physical pain. This was something deeper, something that settled in the soul. He was an old man, approaching the end of a long and decorated life. And like many who near the end, he began to look back, not just at the blueprints and the prototypes, but at the ripples his work had sent out across the world. And the ripples had become a tidal wave. In 2012, just a year before his death, at the age of 93, Mikhail Kalashnikov did something that suggests the wall inside his mind had finally crumbled. He wrote a letter, a long, rambling, and deeply personal letter. It wasn't to a politician or a general or a historian. He wrote it to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. Think about that for a moment. A man who was a product of the officially atheist Soviet state, a decorated communist hero, reaching out not to the Kremlin, but to the church. He was seeking a different kind of absolution. The letter is a portrait of a mind in turmoil, a soul wrestling with a legacy of its own making. My spiritual pain is unbearable, he wrote. That phrase, the unbearable spiritual pain. It is the sound of a lifetime of carefully constructed defenses giving way. He asked the patriarch, the head of the church, a question that is both simple and impossibly complex. I keep having the same unsolved question, he writes. If my rifle took people's lives, can it be that I, a Christian and an Orthodox believer, was to blame for their deaths? He tries to answer it himself, even in the letter. He repeats the old defense. He made it to protect the motherland. He wasn't to blame for how others used it, but the fact that he is asking the question, and asking it of a spiritual leader, tells you everything. The old answers were no longer holding. They were no longer enough to keep the ghosts at bay in the quiet of the night. He continues, trying to reconcile the designer with the consequences. He talks about the church being built in his hometown, the bells ringing, and how he feels a connection to it. He is a man searching for grace, searching for peace. But the question of blame, of culpability, haunts every line. The longer I live, he wrote, the more this question drills itself into my brain, and the more I wonder why the Lord allowed man to have the devilish desires of envy, greed, and aggression. It is a profound and deeply human cry. The inventor, The master of mechanics and steel is confronted with the flawed, unpredictable, and often dark mechanics of the human heart. He had created a perfect tool, but he had given it to an imperfect species, and the weight of that knowledge, accumulated over decades, had become a crushing burden. You can feel the conflict in his words, the pride versus the pain. He mentions that his weapon was created for defense, not offense, the old refrain, but then he immediately follows it with the torment, the spiritual anguish, the thought of every life cut short by the cold, efficient cycling of a bolt carrier and a gas piston that he had perfected. Was he responsible? If a man forges a sword, is he to blame for the battles it is used in? If a man discovers fire, is he to blame for the arsonist? These are ancient questions. But for Mikhail Kalashnikov, they were not philosophical exercises. They were the torment of his final years. He was the man who had forged the sword. He was the man who had given fire to the world, and the world had used it to burn. The church, for its part, offered him comfort. The patriarch wrote back, praising him as a patriot. The church, he was told, has a clear position when a weapon serves to protect the fatherland. The church supports its creators and the soldiers who use it. He was absolved, at least in an official capacity. He was told he was not to blame. But can a letter truly quiet a soul? Can the words of another man silence the questions that drill themselves into your brain? We can only imagine him, in those last months, a frail man, surrounded by the accolades of a nation, a living legend. But inside, a battle was raging. A battle far more complex than any his rifle had ever been used in. The pride of the engineer, the man who solved a complex mechanical problem, warring with the profound, spiritual grief of a man who saw the catastrophic human cost of his solution. He died in December of 2013. He was buried with full state honors in the Federal Military Memorial Cemetery, a hero to the end. His statue stands in Moscow, holding his creation, a monument to the man and the machine. But the true legacy is not one of bronze or stone. It is in the unanswered question he left behind. The question he posed to the church, to the world, and perhaps, most of all, to himself. How much of a creation belongs to its creator? When its echo becomes a roar that drowns out the original intent, is the inventor deafened by it too? The story of Mikhail Kalashnikov in his final years is not the story of a weapon. It is the story of a conscience. It is a quiet, somber epilogue to a very loud and violent history. It is a reminder that the tools we make, the things we put out into the world, can take on lives of their own. They can travel to places we never intended and do things we never imagined. And sometimes, they come back to haunt the person who first brought them to life. The unbearable spiritual pain. That is the final cost, not measured in rubles or dollars or even in lives. It is the internal price paid by a man who gave the world a simple, reliable way to express its oldest, darkest impulses. He wanted to build a shield, but the world, it seems, is always more interested in a sword, and he was forced, in the twilight of his life, to see himself as the world's most prolific swordmaker. And so we leave him there, in the quiet of his final reflections, a man of steel and springs, of pins and receivers, finally confronting the ghost in his machine. The story of the rifle is one of noise, of chaos and fire. But its creator's end is a story of silence, of a long, dark night of the soul, of a question asked to God, with no clear answer returned. Just the quiet, persistent hum of a world still saturated with his work, and the heavy, unbearable weight of a legacy forged in fire, a legacy that would outlive him and continue to shape the world, long after the old inventor had finally found his own peace. And so that weight, that legacy, did not get buried with the man. It couldn't. It had already escaped. It had seeped out from under the door of the secret design bureaus. It had crossed guarded borders in the dead of night, and it had spread across the globe like a rumor whispered on the wind, a rumor of reliability, a rumor of power, a rumor of revolution. A legacy is not a static thing, you see. It is not an entry in a history book or a plaque on a wall. It is a living, breathing entity. It changes. It adapts. It is reinterpreted by every generation that encounters it. And the legacy of the Avtomat Kalashnikova was only just beginning its most powerful transformation. It was becoming more than a rifle. It was becoming an idea, a symbol. How does that happen? How does a simple collection of stamped steel, wood, and springs, designed in the cold aftermath of a devastating war, become an icon recognized in nearly every corner of the world? How does it find its way onto the flags of nations, into the lyrics of songs, and onto the silver screen? To understand that, you have to understand what the rifle came to represent, far beyond the intentions of its designers. For millions, it became the symbol of the underdog, the tool of the disenfranchised, the great equalizer in a world of unequal power. Think of it. In the second half of the 20th century, as colonial empires crumbled and new nations fought to be born, the world was a chessboard for two superpowers. One offered complex, expensive, and often temperamental rifles that required extensive training and a clean supply line. The other offered the Kalashnikov, simple, cheap to produce in staggering numbers, so forgiving that it could be buried in mud, pulled out, and still fire. It didn't need a professional army to maintain it. It needed only a will to fight. And so, the silhouette of that rifle, with its distinctive curved magazine, became synonymous with liberation movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was the rifle of the Viet Cong, holding out against a technological superpower in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was the rifle of the freedom fighter in Angola, in Nicaragua, in Afghanistan. It was in Mozambique where this symbolism became permanently etched into the fabric of a nation. During their long and brutal war for independence against Portuguese rule, the Frelimo fighters were armed with the AK-47. It was the weapon that carried them to victory. And when they finally founded their new nation in 1975, what did they choose to put on their national flag? Not a lion, not an eagle, not a star. They chose the tools that had built their freedom. A hoe, representing agriculture. A book, representing education. And crossed over them both, an Avtomat Kalashnikova, representing defense and vigilance. Just pause and think about that for a moment. A weapon of war, an assault rifle, placed at the very center of a nation's identity, displayed with pride. It's a shocking image to some, but it speaks volumes about the rifle's journey. For the people of Mozambique, it wasn't a symbol of terror. It was a symbol of their own strength, their own sacrifice, their own hard-won sovereignty. It was the physical manifestation of their right to exist. The rifle had transcended its function. It had become a piece of political art, a declaration printed on cloth and flown in the wind. But a symbol is a powerful and dangerous thing. It can be co-opted. Its meaning can be twisted. The very same qualities that made the AK-47 the choice of the freedom fighter also made it the choice of the terrorist, the warlord, the child soldier, and the drug cartel. Its simplicity, its reliability, its sheer, terrifying availability. The gun did not care about ideology. It did not distinguish between a just cause and a criminal enterprise. It only worked. Always. And so another, darker image began to emerge. The flag of Hezbollah, a militant group in the Middle East, features a stylized green Kalashnikov held aloft. Here, the meaning shifts. It is no longer just a symbol of national defense, but of armed resistance, of religious and political struggle, an image of perpetual conflict. You see it in the hands of Somali pirates, their small skiffs dwarfed by the massive cargo ships they prey upon. You see it clutched by child soldiers in harrowing photographs from Central Africa, the weapon often larger than the arms that hold it. A tool of empowerment in one context becomes a tool of exploitation in another. The symbol's meaning is not in the object itself, but in the eye of the beholder, and in the hands that grip its wooden stock. This duality is the very heart of the Kalashnikov story. It is a masterpiece of utilitarian design, and it is an enabler of untold human misery. It is a liberator, and it is an oppressor. It is both. It is all of these things at once. And this complex, contradictory identity cemented its place in our global culture. It became the default rifle in our collective imagination. When you watch a movie and you see the villain's henchmen, what are they carrying? More often than not, it's a Kalashnikov. It has become cinematic shorthand for the other, the insurgent, the bad guy. Its stark, mechanical appearance is instantly recognizable. There is no sleekness to it, no elegance. It looks like what it is, a tool made for a hard job. And Hollywood, along with the world of video games, has burned this image into our minds. The clatter of its action, the distinctive report of its 7.62mm round. These are sounds we know, even if we don't know why we know them. The AK-47 is a character in its own right, one that rarely needs an introduction. It has appeared in thousands of films, from gritty war dramas to over-the-top action blockbusters. It has been the weapon of choice for countless digital soldiers in the most popular video games ever made. For generations of people who have never seen or touched a real firearm, the Kalashnikov is the first and only rifle they can name. It exists in the digital world just as powerfully as it exists in the physical one. And while the rifle was busy becoming a cultural icon, a ghost in the machine of global media, the physical object itself did not stand still. Back in Russia, the story wasn't over. The Izhevsk machine building plant, the very place where Kalashnikov had perfected his design, continued its work. The world changed, and the rifle had to change with it. In 2013, the old factory was restructured and reborn as the Kalashnikov concern. This wasn't just a name change. It was a signal. The legend was being modernized, corporatized, and marketed for a new century. The classic AK-47, with its milled receiver and wooden furniture, is now a historical artifact. Its direct descendants, the stamped receiver AKM and the smaller caliber AK-74, formed the backbone of the Soviet and then Russian military for decades. But the 21st century demanded more. Soldiers now expected modularity, the ability to add scopes, lights, lasers, and grips. The old Soviet design, beautiful in its simplicity, was not built for that. So the engineers at the Kalashnikov concern went back to the drawing board, not to replace the old design, but to build upon it, to evolve it. The result is the new generation. The AK-12, the AK-15, the AK-19. At a glance, they are still unmistakably Kalashnikovs. The long-stroke gas piston system, the rotating bolt, the big, forgiving safety lever, the soul of the machine is still there. But now it is wrapped in a modern polymer shell. It has a full-length Picatinny rail on top, allowing for the mounting of any optic a soldier could want. It has an adjustable, folding stock, an improved muzzle brake to tame the recoil. It is a more ergonomic, more accurate, and more versatile weapon. It is the Kalashnikov of the digital age. It's a strange thing to consider. That a design conceived in the rubble of Stalingrad, a design based on principles of absolute, brute force simplicity, could prove so adaptable, so timeless. Most weapon systems of that era are long gone, relegated to museums and collectors' vaults. The German G-44, the American M1 Garand, they are relics of a bygone time, but the Kalashnikov endures. It evolves. It proves that the core of a good idea is more powerful than any fleeting technological trend. The genius of Mikhail Kalashnikov was not in creating a perfect rifle for 1947. It was in creating a system so robust, so fundamentally sound, that it could still be the basis for a frontline rifle 75 years later. Before we reflect on the final meaning of this journey, it is a good moment to pause. If you are finding this story, and others like it on the channel, to be a source of calm or a way to quiet your mind, please consider subscribing to The Dark Historian. It is a small, simple act that allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. Your support is deeply appreciated. Now, let us return to that small workshop in Izhevsk and the long shadow it cast upon the world. So where does that leave us? We are left with this object, this thing of steel and wood, or now, of steel and polymer. It sits on the table of history, heavy with the weight of millions of stories. It is a testament to engineering brilliance, a monument to the power of a simple, reliable idea. Its action is studied in engineering schools. Its production methods revolutionized manufacturing. From a purely mechanical standpoint, it is an undeniable success. One of the most significant inventions of the 20th century. But you cannot separate the machine from its use. You cannot admire the design without acknowledging the sound it makes. And the sound it has made for over 70 years is the sound of conflict, the sound of death. For every story of a freedom fighter using it to liberate their country, there is another story. A story of a village massacred, a story of a journalist executed, a story of a school attacked, a story of a government overthrown and replaced with a brutal dictatorship. The rifle was the tool in all of these stories. The silent, impartial enabler. Mikhail Kalashnikov himself wrestled with this for his entire life. He would often say he designed it for defense, to protect the motherland. He would blame the politicians for where the rifle ended up, and there is truth in that. An inventor cannot control their invention once it is released into the world. But that offers little comfort. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. He wanted to build a shield for his country. He ended up forging a sword for the entire world. And a sword, by its very nature, is double-edged. So what is the final verdict? What is the ultimate legacy of the AK-47? Perhaps the answer is that there isn't one. There is no simple, neat conclusion to a story this vast and this complicated. Its legacy is a tangled knot of contradictions. It is a symbol of hope and a symbol of terror, a tool of revolution and a tool of oppression, a source of national pride and a cause of global instability. It is the rifle of the soldier defending his home, and the rifle of the criminal taking a life for a wallet. It is all of it. The story of the Kalashnikov is not really the story of a gun. It is the story of us. It is the story of our conflicts, our ideologies, our endless struggle for power and for freedom. The rifle is just a mirror, and in its dark, oiled steel, it reflects the very best and the very worst of what we are capable of. It reflects our ingenuity, our resilience, our desire to protect what we love. and it reflects our capacity for violence, our cruelty, our greed. And so, the story ends where it began, with a single object. Imagine it now, resting in the quiet of a museum long after the last conflict has ended. The lights are low, the air is still, the wood of the stock is worn smooth by the hands of countless unknown soldiers. The steel of the receiver is scarred with the marks of use, each scratch a silent testament to a moment of desperation, or fear, or resolve. It no longer makes a sound, it is just a shape in the darkness. But it is never truly silent, because it holds echoes, the echoes of history, the echoes of shouts and whispers in a dozen different languages, the echo of a young sergeant's dream to build a better rifle for his comrades, the echo of $1 billion global industry, the echo of a freedom fighter's cry, the echo of a victim's last breath. It is an object that contains a universe of human experience, a simple machine that became a legend, and it will remain, long after we are gone, a quiet, somber reminder of a century defined by fire, by iron, and by the relentless, enduring power of a single, dark, and brilliant idea. A reminder that the tools we create can take on a life of their own and write chapters in our history that we never intended, and they will continue to do so long after their creators have turned to dust.